So we want to thank all of you first for coming out, taking time out of your schedule to come see us and listen to what we have to say. We also would like to very much thank Ron Paul Institute co-sponsors that have helped us get here, and their names are on the back of our little Freedom Report that we've handed out. So we're very grateful to these people for helping us out. The Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity started, believe it or not, 5 years ago this month. It was April 18th, I think, 2013, where we had our opening up on Capitol Hill. And in those 5 years, we published probably 6,000 or 7,000 articles on our website, ronpaulinstitute.org. We've had millions and millions of visitors. We have they tried to strangle us in the crib, of course. The day we opened, Jamie Kirchick and a lot of the neocons were talking about how dangerous we were, which made us very energized and very happy and very excited. So we've done that. We've done, this is our fourth conference, and we're so fortunate to be doing it with Jacob Hornberger and the Future of Freedom Foundation, which is one of my absolute favorite groups out there. So we're really thrilled to be with them. And so this is our fourth conference at which we've sold all of our seats. It looks like some stragglers, but technically our 4 sellouts in a row, so we're happy, very happy about that. Some of you may have heard of a little show called the Ron Paul Liberty Report that we do in our little studio at Clute, Texas, and it's really a lavish studio. It's you wouldn't believe it's state of the art. Actually, the studio is state of the art, but anyway, so we do that, and we've actually had a big surge. I was teasing Dr. Paul that unfortunately war is kind of profitable for us too, because our viewership has skyrocketed after Trump decided to send some missiles over to Syria. But we have about close to 140,000 subscribers to our YouTube channel. We've had something like over 11 million views of our program the past 3 years. We do it Monday through Friday on YouTube. YouTube/Ron Paul Liberty Report. And so we spend a lot of time doing that, and a lot of outreach doing that. And we're just absolutely thrilled to be here talking about one of our favorite topics, the most important topic, non-interventionism. It's a broad topic. It's foreign policy. It's in our lives here at home. They all come together, as Dr. Paul always says. But we are so thrilled, and we hope that we can provide you with some stimulating information and discussion, and most importantly, for all of you to get to know each other. This is the strength of our movement. This is why we come together rather than just watch videos. To meet each other, to share experiences. You never know, you may strike up a business deal or a friendship. So important to get together. This is what scares the authoritarian state away. This is what, as Bumper always says, authoritarian societies do not allow. So thank you very much, and welcome to the conference.
All right, I'd like to offer my welcome as well. I'm Jacob Hornberger. I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Our mission at FFF since the very beginning, some 29 years ago, has been to present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the free society. And we're really excited to be here. This is actually my third time to this beautiful city, and it's really nice to be back, and it's especially nice to be here to share ideas on liberty with everyone here. We're especially excited to be doing this program with the Ron Paul Institute. We all have our heroes in history, right? Well, Ron is one of my real-life heroes that's still here. And gosh, he's played such an instrumental role in the advancement of liberty, as everyone in this room knows. When he first was running for president on the GOP ticket, my vice president, Bart Frazier, and I, we went to New Hampshire, and we went door-to-door campaigning for him because he inspired us. We believed in what he was saying. He was speaking truth to power. And then had the good fortune of speaking at some of his campaign rallies, one in Philadelphia. And so when Dan contacted me and said, would y'all be interested in doing a joint program on foreign policy? I mean, we didn't hesitate. We know that the Ron Paul Institute and FFF are on the exact same page when it comes to this burning issue of our time. And so we said, absolutely, count us in. And so that's how all this got arranged. And then we came up with the idea of having it here in Charleston because a longtime friend and supporter of ours, a local guy named Walter Carr, has been pleading with us to do a program in Charleston for many, many years. And we finally said, okay, Walter, get him off our back. And we're so happy we did. And as a matter of fact, Local Boy Makes Good. Walter, many of you know Walter. He's been here. He says he's not a native to Charleston, but he's been here 50 years. And he's recently become a member of our Board of Trustees at the Future of Freedom Foundation. He's been a longtime supporter and friend and personal friend, and we're really honored and pleased that he would join our board. You'll find written materials on your chairs that we've put out. As all of y'all know, or probably you know, this is final exam week, so you do have homework here. We expect a term paper based on these written materials by the end of next week. I know there's some of you supporters that have come a long ways, longtime supporters of FFF, been with us for 29 years, and we couldn't do it without you. And we would invite you, those of you that are not familiar with FFF, we'd invite you to become acquainted with us and size us up with the quality of this program today. We're a small foundation, but we got a lot of heart. We believe in the power of ideas, sound ideas on liberty, to transform a society. And that's what we're about. We're about changing the world, and especially that part of the world that's right here in the United States. And we believe in the importance of principles. When I said that we present an uncompromising case for liberty, I meant it. That if you go back over our written literature for the last 29 years, you will search in vain for any compromise of any libertarian principle in any of our written materials and all the thousands of articles. And why is this? Because we believe that sound ideas on liberty and adherence to principle are the best way to achieve what everyone in this room wants to achieve, and that's a free society, prosperous society, harmonious society, and of course a peaceful society, which is what this conference is all about. And we rely on voluntary donations, just like the Ron Paul Institute does. And if you like our overall perspective, you like our passion for liberty, our love for liberty, we would like to invite you to consider becoming a donor to FFF and the Ron Paul Institute as well. That we rely, as you can imagine, the $5 doesn't begin to cover the cost of a program like this. But our formula has always been, look, charge a nominal fee or even free. We go into college campuses, and of course we don't charge anything, and then hope that people believe in what we're doing, and then fund us with donations, and that's how we put programs like this together. In fact, one of our newest programs that we're really pleased with is we noticed we were taking our conferences on the drug war and the horrors of the drug war to college campuses, and we noticed that African American students were not coming to our programs. So we decided to do something about that. And so we dug up a list of all the historically black colleges and universities, and we started making contacts with students there and professors there just in the blind, sending them emails saying this is what we want to do. And now we have this program established at FFF to go into HBCUs and take our program to them. And we've done one in Morgan State in Baltimore, another one at Florida A&M in Florida, and we're working with 3 other student groups now and professors to do more in the fall. And that's where your donations fund. That's what your money goes to. And so those of you that are here, I know you travel long distance, some of you, and we're grateful for that. And we're grateful for your support. And and if you join our Freedom Club, FF Freedom Club, with a $250 donation or more, you get a video message from me every month. So thank you very much for coming. It's hard. I wish it were raining outside, because I know there's an opportunity cost with this beautiful weather after this horrifically cold winter. Thank you for coming, and I think we're going to put on a really good program. That's our goal here today. We got 4 speakers. I think you'll enjoy all of them. And but as a prelude to that, we have the honor and pleasure of having a special guest to share his perspectives on this important issue of our time. I know Mark Sanford is in a heated political race, and so I want to give him a little bit of political cover here. He is not here to endorse the Future of Freedom Foundation. He's not here to endorse the Ron Paul Institute. He's here accepting our invitation to share his perspectives on this burning issue of our time. And we appreciate him taking the time to do so. Please welcome Congressman and former South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford.
I'll be exceedingly brief because I have absolutely nothing to add to the equation this morning. Jacob, I appreciate so much the chance to be here, though. I appreciate the chance to be with you all. I'm here really for three reasons. I'm here, one, because Ron Paul is here. And when I was last in Congress, there were a whole lot of votes where it'd be whatever the number was to 2 on the Republican side, and it would be myself and Ron. Inevitably, I'd go up to Ron and say, well, why are you voting as you are on this one? And he would explain it, and as he always does, he'd be crystal clear in his logic, he'd be sound in his reasoning, and he was an inspiration then, and he's an inspiration now. And since he was in this neck of the woods, I wanted to come by just to say, I appreciate what you've done at many different levels to advance liberty in our country, and I'd ask that you give him a round of applause. I'm also here because Wally Carr is a friend who's right up here. He said, come on by for a minute. And if folks at home say, come on by, you say, yes, sir. You click your heels and you salute. And most of all, I'm here, though, to say thank you for what you're doing. This notion, as we all know, of preserving freedom within an open political system is an amazingly delicate balancing act. And if you look at the pages of history, more often than not, it's been lost rather than gained. And so what you all are doing in having a discussion about non-intervention and how that is part of the formula to preserving liberty, I think to be incredibly important, and therefore want to come by and say thank you for what you're doing. I jotted down a few notes. I observed this. Never-ending wars are horrific from the standpoint of building enemies, from shredding Congress's traditional role, from wearing out troops, from the standpoint of sending conflicting signals to both allies and opponents alike, and in spending trillions of dollars. But before I get into any of that, I would say, one, welcome to Charleston. As Jacob just mentioned, it's gorgeous outside. I highly recommend that you get out and explore. I grew up on a farm about an hour south of here. So Charleston itself is not an area unfamiliar with conflict. And if you go down to the farm that I grew up on, oddly enough, it was the dividing line between the North and the South for the first 3 years of the Civil War. Because the Union, with its superior naval capacity, had come in and immediately captured Beaufort and the surrounding sea islands, and they set up their southern blockade headquarters from there. And yet they didn't have the strength to pierce the mainland, if you will, of the South. And so there was this, frankly, not uneasy, but very easy truce that existed there on the banks of the Coosaw River with the Confederates on one side and the Union on the other. It became so routine that there was a gunboat, the George Washington, that once a week would circle the sea islands to make sure that the Confederates weren't up to something funny. And it became so routine that they, in fact, stopped one day to actually anchor and go fishing in front of the farm that I grew up on. The river is very wide in front of the farm that I grew up on, maybe 1.5 miles or so wide, maybe 2 miles. I mean, very wide river at this point. It's opening up out into the ocean. They stop and go fishing. Well, it turns out the Chisholm family, who's there on the place, they happen to have a cannon in one of the barns. They wheel the cannon out. To their amazement, they shoot, hit, and sink the George Washington. 900 Confederate troops are brought in to try and retrieve the cannons off the George Washington. A similar number were brought in on the Union side. Nobody is able to retrieve anything, and it wasn't until sort of notorious sheriff from the Low Country, Sheriff McTeer, had a report from a fisherman of something being out in the creek. They go out there, they retrieve the cannons, and so to this day, if you go to Beaufort, South Carolina, there in front of the Armory, you will find cannons that were on the George Washington at the time of its sinking from there on, again, the farm that I grew up on. What's also interesting, though, is that Stephen Bull's son tragically was killed in the Battle of Bull Run. He became so incensed that there was a little skirmish up the road, a place called Lubico, that he wanders up there. He cuts the heads off a number of Union soldiers, takes them home, boils the heads, and made, quote, Yankee skull drinking cups that are constantly referred to in the letters as I did research on the place growing up. And my point with these different strange stories is you don't need Yankee skull drinking cups. You don't need to bring troops in on one side, troops on the other. What we all know is that intervention is not free, that there's a cost either at the human level, at the political level, at the financial level. And this notion, again, of what you all are getting at, of saying, how do we avoid that cost, to be very, very important, whether that's illustrated, again, on a farm I grew up on about an hour south of here, or some of what's happened in Charleston over the years, or some of what's happening in the Middle East right now. I'd make just a couple of quick points, and again, I have nothing to offer. You actually have experts that will come and speak to you. I'm here to simply say, welcome to Charleston. I'm glad you're this part of the world. But I'd make these 4 observations. One, what we're doing now, it strikes me, really is building enemies. I mean, the whole point of military power and military force is to bring about change that couldn't otherwise be made. So if you can't make it via diplomacy and statecraft, well, then you'll just have to force the issue with military. And what I think is interesting is in the military, they have a term where they talk about center of gravity. Center of gravity is what could I do to my opponent's position or force that would undermine their ability to bring force in my direction. And what you see happening around the world right now as we have this sort of, half on, half off interventionist strategy is that we're in fact cementing rather than dislocating the real center of gravity from the standpoint of terrorism. It's ideology. It's not a number of arms. It's not a number of people. I don't know if you all have seen Ken Burns' documentary on the Vietnam War. It's absolutely fascinating. If you haven't, I'd highly recommend it. But it goes into McNamara's notion of body count. And they're on the nightly television when I was a young guy. I remember watching the nightly count. We're winning. There's a bigger body count. Well, we weren't impacting their center of gravity. As a consequence, we all know what happened in Vietnam. You can look at a lot of intervention these days, and you'd see the same phenomenon reoccurring. So the question is, are we in fact impacting center of gravity from the standpoint of the force, or with collateral damage and other? I mean, you could be the greatest house guest in the world, but if you came over to my house and stayed for 20 years, inevitably you'd break some china. One night you might come in a little bit too late. Another morning you might get up too early. There are going to be some rubs if you stay that long. And so you look at our interventionist strategy right now and the way in which, again, we're in fact creating in many cases more enemies than we're not. And we're certainly not undermining the center of gravity that exists on that side of the equation. I would secondly say what has hit me is we're really shredding Congress's role, and I'm sure that Ron and other experts are going to get into the details of this. But this notion of treating an AUMF as a blank check is crazy. I mean, here we are, in essence, 20 years later, and we treat it as a blank check. As a consequence, we undermine that which the Constitution made so clear. What the Founding Fathers knew was at the end of the day, body bags don't come back into Washington, D.C. They didn't go to congressional districts across this country, and therefore they wanted members of Congress to sign on the dotted line. If you want to risk financial and human capital, then your name needs to be on it. And that's not what we've done. And as a consequence, we've really undermined Congress's role in the authorization and the use of force. Thirdly, I'd say what's interesting is that we're wearing out troops. So if you were to talk to the folks on armed services, both House and Senate, they would talk about how accident rates are actually going up. They talk about divorce rates. They talk about a lot of things happening in the military today. And the solution is just give us more money. But what you all, again, are getting at is to say, no, let's try actually a different strategy. We don't need necessarily more money, but we need a different strategy in the way that we're employing force and using force around the world. I'll make 2 last points, and I'll sit down, and I look forward to hearing from the experts. I think that we're really sending conflicting signals to friend and foe alike on again, the use of force. We don't have intervention or non-intervention as a strategy. We've got politically driven intervention as our strategy. And there is a difference. Because if you're going to hold sort of moral authority in these terms, it's got to be one or the other. It's got to be black or it's white. But this notion of a middle ground, of, in essence, holding actions, as we saw in Vietnam, simply don't work. And so from a strategic standpoint, if you look at what China is doing in the South China Sea right now, I think it's frightening. I mean, the fact that they're building air bases on reefs and they're clearly establishing their territory in what I think is clearly international territorial waters says, well, boy, if we had an interventionist strategy, I think we'd be making a bit more noise than we are there. We're not. In other cases, if you really want to have moral authority in places like, I won't go into different atrocities, but we've seen a lot of them around the world, then you'd say we got to be involved there. But we're picking and choosing based on very different things. And I think that it erodes, regardless of which side of the equation you might be on, and I know where this group is, it really erodes our ability to have standing as we press forward, either from a non-intervention or from an intervention standpoint. And finally, I'd make this point, which is that we're spending trillions. And Ron was the one that showed me the way back when, because he was country when country wasn't cool when it came to spending. It's gone full circle. It wasn't cool, then it was, and now it's no longer cool. I mean, nobody talks about it all in Washington these days. But it's, with the exception of his son. I think we're at a tipping point as a civilization. It's always the straw that breaks the camel's back. We're remarkably close to really, really bad things happening to our economy, to future inflation, to the value of the dollar, to ultimately every young person's here ability to make a living and sustain a standard of living based on the fact that we're spending more than we can afford. We've done that for a while. But, there was a comedian, I don't remember his name, he said, that which cannot exist forever stops, or something like that. Do you remember the quote? I'm not exactly paraphrasing it right, but it's a good one. Remember it. But that which cannot go on forever won't. That's what it was. And what we have right now is something that can't go on forever. But we're inside a 10-year window. If you look at the debt to GDP numbers, you look at interest cost, there are a lot of indicators out there that say that we're nearing the stopping point. And so I'll leave you with a really depressing quote. Sir Alex Francis Tytler was a Scottish historian who studied history for the whole of his life. He gets to the end of his life, and the quote that's attributed to him was that a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote for themselves largesse from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always fails under loose fiscal policy and is generally followed by dictatorship. The average age of the world's great civilizations has been 200 years. These nations have progressed through this sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith to great courage to liberty, liberty to abundance, abundance to selfishness, selfishness to complacency, complacency to apathy, apathy to dependency, and from dependency back again into bondage. And indeed, if you look at the timeline of civilizations across the annals of history, you see that there's absolutely something to get what he was getting at. We're at a tipping point, and for the reasons that I described above, and more than anything, simply based on spending alone and where we are on the spending cycle, it's really important what you all are doing in saying, wait a minute, we need to take a different approach. One last thought on that. Paul Kennedy wrote an interesting book years ago talking about the rise and fall of great powers. It was entitled that. And he talked about how no nation on earth has ever been able to maintain military supremacy without first retaining and maintaining economic supremacy, which makes sense. It's for the reason that Russia and Soviet Union and other places fell. So, again, I just want to say thank you for what you're doing. You're on an incredibly important theme that has everything to do with the kind of America that my four boys will one day inherit, your kids, your grandkids. But this isn't a kid or grandkid thing. This is in our generation, And I think the chickens come home to roost on this issue in the next 10 years. Thanks again for what y'all do. Appreciate it.
You know, I've got the greatest job in the world. I get up at around 6:30 in the morning. I usually have an email from Dr. Paul because we're both scouring the news pretty early because we got to figure out what we're going to do that day. We want to put something in the news. We want to be able to explain it in our own way. We'll get together, I guess, around 9:30, 10 o'clock at the studio. We'll start hashing it out. He'll have several sheets of paper. I'll have a couple of sheets of paper, comparing notes, putting things together, trying to figure out what we're going to say, how we're going to talk about the news. And I tell you honestly, from the bottom of my heart, it's such great fun. It's such hard work. I have such admiration, and it's such a joy to work with the next person who will be speaking to you, Dr. Ron Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nice to be among friends, let me tell you. See, I didn't get any applause when I was in Washington, so I'm loving it now. But Mark's still fighting the battle up there for us. So, Mark, and thank you for your nice words. And Bumper, Bumper, that's Jacob. I guess people know him by both. Jacob, you need congratulations for the Future Freedoms Foundation. Great work you've done, and we've worked with you for a long time. But, you know, the other person that doesn't get as much credit, and it's partially his fault, because he went and took an institute and named it after somebody other than himself, and that's Daniel McAdams. He's the one that does all the work on keeping our programs going. But it is a real pleasure to be here, and it's an important subject. Most people know that I talk a lot about economics, and I'll probably end up talking about economics today. But when I first got interested in economic policy, it happened really in the 60s, and I came across the Austrian economists, and they were making some predictions, and they were claiming that this Bretton Woods agreement was bad news, it was going to fall apart, and that sort of thing, and obviously it did. And I consider August 21st in 1971 as a big event when the system went from a pseudo-gold standard to a no-gold standard and the fiat standard, which we're living with today. But as time went on, and the more I thought about politics and economics, it finally dawned on me that there's a very close connection between the two, because you have to pay for everything. You have to pay for all this foreign intervention. And how do they do it? How do we get American people to work so hard to pay for all these wars? Well, guess what? They don't. It's a game of fraud. They captured the world reserve currency. They had license to steal by printing money, and then license to go and get involved when they shouldn't be involved. Well, how if people don't want to donate the money? Just think if at the end of the month every American citizen would have to write a check to cover all the deficit. The whole thing would end immediately. So it's the gimmicks that go on, and it's the seductiveness of the monetary system that allows this runaway welfare system to work, and also our empire, around the world. So, how does it get ended? People ask me, how's it going to end? Are we going to get more people to help Mark up there to get and pass these bills? I don't think so. We should get as many as we can to try to put things together when it's necessary. But it's not going to happen. There's too many people dependent. It's an addiction. I mean, they worry about opioid addiction. If you want to really know about an addiction, it's the addiction of the American people to the U.S. Congress spending money, and they're addicted to deficits. That's the addiction that we have to attack. Well, how did we finally get rid of that war in Vietnam? That is vivid in my mind, even though the Korean War has been vivid too back in the days, and there's interesting things happening there. But Vietnam in the 60s was an interesting decade. It was the period of time that I was drafted and put into the military, and it was a disaster. I mean, you think we have problems now. Sometimes when people get despondent, I think, well, think of depression. I was born in the depression. Think of World War II, bad times. Think about that stupidity in Korea, bad news. Think of Vietnam. 60,000 people died. American military died. So in 68, we elected a Republican to end the war, and he was elected. 30 more thousand Americans died. And the American people were just desperate and screaming out, for it to end. Well, finally, they weren't screaming enough, is what the problem was. Finally, in the 60s, the people got fed up, and they started demonstrating in this country, and the war ended. And they did what nobody wanted us to do. And Johnson, the reason he kept sending thousands of young men and women over there to be killed for no good reason, he says, I'm not going to be the president during the first war that we're going to lose. Well, he was. A total loss. And what happened? The results of that was that Vietnam, instead of the domino effect going totally communist, in due time they became more westernized than the country that we left in a division, Korea, and they're still, hopefully, some good's going to come out soon, but they left divided, but Vietnam unified. And just think of how much more was won in peace than in war. Why doesn't that wake the American people up? But the connection between the war and the financial system is very, very clear in my mind. Because, World War II, they said, was fought by us as kids going around and collecting up quarters to get war bonds. That's total gimmickry. That was a very, very small fraction. That was just to discipline people to join the war effort. So the real way they paid for World War II is inflation. They printed a ton of money, and they were able to get away with it. So if the people aren't alert to the spending, and even when they try, the Congress is not alert, how does it get done? What will not be done unless we do something with that organization called the Federal Reserve. And I have one suggestion that we do about that. Just get rid of the Federal Reserve, and then we wouldn't have to worry them financing. The Federal Reserve is a taxing authority, really, is what it is, because it's indirectly taxing people, and it's a totally immoral, fraudulent system, because the people who pay the tax are invisible. It's the people who get zonked with inflationary pressures, and it always happens that some groups suffer more than others. Fixed income people, the elderly, and poor people, they get the higher inflation rate. So they tax the money, they subsidize the military-industrial complex, and anybody who wants to make a buck off the war, and they get benefits from it. At the same time, the payments are from the average class, middle class. Mises, as early as 1912, said that socialism doesn't work, and it turns out he was right. It's too bad that more people don't recognize that. But he also said that if you continue to do that and debase the currency, and he certainly had studied monetary history like nobody else, he says what you will do is wipe out the middle class. And that is what's happening right now. The middle class is in shambles, and there's a lot of social anger. As interesting and as serious as our interventions foreign policy is, and as bad as the spending for the social welfare program, and that's all part of the big system that comes together. But the real threat, I believe, is the social conflicts of the maldistribution of wealth. The rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and guess what they're getting away with? With the result of the cultural Marxists and the people, in the deep state, the propagandists and the warmongers, is they're saying too much freedom, too much free market, too much capitalism. It's capitalism that's caused this problem. And we have a up-and-coming generation now that if you look at the professors in our colleges, not good news. Fortunately, though, since I go to campuses and talk to a lot of young people, and there's some young people here, that it is not a monolith. There are young people. There are people from YAL in this conference here, and YAL is infiltrating and convincing people. And besides, it's not a numbers game; it's an ideological game. And the ideas of liberty are alive and well. And that's why I think that we have a chance. Except when you look at the news and you don't have much choice on television. I think, Daniel, and maybe that's the reason we get a few customers on our Liberty Report. But no, the people can't trust it because there is not two sets of televisions. There aren't two political parties. Anybody who thinks, oh boy, I'm a Republican, I'm going to vote Republican because they're the conservatives. It's a joke. And what about? We had Republicans in during the 80s, and that was not a very successful year for conservatives. And if you look at so far right now, the deficit's going up faster than any Democratic administration ever. So the spending goes on, and but there's only two groups that you have to deal with for the spending. If you can handle that, then we have solved our problem. It's the conservatives and the liberals, and they just have different reasons they want to spend the money, and they're authoritarians. Is what is the problem? Now, somebody told me once, Ronnie, they said, you know why you didn't win the nomination to run in the campaign for president? I said, well, yeah, I sort of know. I have a pretty good idea of what's behind the scenes. And they say, no, you are way too negative. And I said, negative? I didn't think I was negative. And they said, well, what did you tell them? Were you for something or against something? Well, it's true. I was against some things. I was against the government, and I promised that I, as a president, don't want to tell you what to do with your personal life. I want to leave you alone. I, as president, don't want to tell the economy how to run. It should be a free market economy and private property. And I don't want to tell anybody around the world how they ought to live and get involved in internal affairs of the nation. If you call that being negative, you can. But I call that liberty. But the big question is, where do we stand? Mark talked a little bit about what to expect, and he's absolutely right. There's danger ahead. Even though I alluded to the fact there were bad times before, more war, more killing, and depression and all these things, I think that even though we have an absence of that in the news every day, I would say that in comparison, I think we face greater danger structurally, because when this comes unglued, it's going to be much more destructive because our institutions basically, survived, the Depression and survived World War II. It was pretty old-fashioned back then. We actually asked the people through the Congress to declare war. Remember? That's a major thing. Now, that doesn't exist. There's a few in Congress that will fight this and say, you have no right to do this. You shouldn't be doing it. And the people are realizing that there's something desperately wrong, but it continues. It continues, but one of the big things that should be changed is how we go to war. And I would say that it's not a complicated factor. Just obey the Constitution, no, nothing else. There was a thing going on, a debate in the International Affairs Committee that I was on, leading up to the Iraq War. And I was, pretty much involved in that. That was an issue that I could just smell because the first speech I gave against the coming war in Iraq was in 1998. So it was a railroad job. They were going to go through and give authority, and even though Bush says, I don't need authority, you can do this just under presidential power, but I'm going to let you do this so you can do this. So when the amendment came up, and I was on the committee, I introduced an amendment for a substitute. And I said, this is an amendment, and it's going to be declaring war against Saddam Hussein. And I said, I'm not going to vote for this, but I'm going to have you vote for it. Because you're starting a war, and you don't want to vote for it. And they nearly got hysterical. about me forcing them to vote up or down. And the chairman of the committee at that time really lectured me, and I really looked down. He said, Congressman Paul, don't you know that that part of the Constitution is anachronistic? We don't follow that part anymore. And he was considered, a champion of the Constitution, had been chairman of the Judiciary Committee and the whole work. But then he spoke what was true. They don't look at it anymore. They don't look at the monetary issue anymore. Where do they get the authority to control all your medical care and all the education in this system? So it's that attitude that invites this authoritarianism. But the foreign policy is obviously very, very dangerous. And it should be a place where we could find an opening. And so far I haven't quite found it, except for a few progressive Democrats and some of our libertarian friends. And that is that if you wanted to work your way through this, you have to find a way to cut spending, but nobody wants to give up on it. I said, all right, let's not start with child health care, even though technically it's not constitutional. We don't want to attack that, which some conservatives will. They attack some social program. But if you suggest in a conservative audience or conservative TV or a liberal TV, I think what we ought to do is cut something out of the military. And they go nuts, this would be horrible. And they don't, but they will never use cut military spending. That's not what they say. They say, you want to cut defense spending. And I said, I'm cutting military spending. He said, what you're doing is destroying the defense of the country. You're jeopardizing our liberties. And quite frankly, as bad as the foreign policy is and the consequence of 9/11, the greatest danger has been the attack on our liberties here at home. And here we're telling other people how to live. One of the discouraging things, I have some things that are encouraging, but one of the really discouraging thing is to fly on the airplanes. Anybody else get discouraged when you go through TSA? If I tell you what, I would do a lot more traveling, a lot more speaking, and be more available for a lot more people if I didn't have to go through TSA. It's terrible. And why we put up with that, with the groping and the nonsense and violation, I don't know why, because it hasn't done one bit of good. And it's all a gimmick, to make us subservient to the state. And that hasn't prevented one thing. And yet we just keep marching in, and I put myself in that category. And we did one time I had a bad episode with that. I did a little program on our Liberty Report. And I said, this is what I think we ought to do. That we ought to demand that our president fly coach and go through the groping line, and things would change. He didn't call me up and say, Ron, that's a good idea. I think I'm going to go and do that. No, not likely. But it really boils down to what people think and understand what liberty is all about. People get all mixed up about it, because liberty to some people is to have free health care and free food stamps and police the world and make sure the good guys win. Because we are an exceptional nation. We have to spread our Americanism, and we have this moral obligation. Since the Soviets are out of the picture, we have to do this because this is our responsibility. Well, that's just the excuse, and that is where the problem is. They want to play on the sympathies of the American people so that they continue to go along with it. But more and more people are getting pretty upset. One of the most encouraging signs right now is that I've seen one poll, and this is one I want to listen to at least. 68% of the American people don't believe a thing the government tells them. And that's progress. No, there's no reason that we should. You should really be skeptical about all economic reports. Now they're talking about, well, maybe inflation's about 3% or so. If they're admitting it might be 3, that means it's 5 or 6. And if you go to shadow stats, it's a lot more than that. So they don't level with us. And there's a purpose for this, and that is to justify what they're doing. One of the most silly things I've I've ever heard of in economics that the Federal Reserve participates in, because all the pressure that is going on, and they pumping in all that money, trillions of dollars of money, and the economy is not responding. They can't figure out, and they have decided it's because prices aren't going up fast enough. If we can make prices go up faster, then everything is going to be okay. And so they set the goal at 2%, which means they want to take 2% of your money every year automatically, which is, again, a tax. But that has been the goal for a long time, and it was already 3% anyway. So right now, I see what's happening is from all this funding the foreign policy as well as funding the welfare state is that the price inflation, and I like to talk about monetary inflation. Prices are going up at a much faster rate, and the economy, in spite of the euphoria that you get on some of the reports in Wall Street, I think the economy is in a lot worse shape because the best measurement of what is happening is the measurement of debt, financial obligation, unfunded liabilities. It's just, it's so big. It's in the trillions and trillions of dollars. And productivity really hasn't improved. The amount of money that we printed and the amount of GDP that's gone up, the GDP has gone up only a small fraction of all the money we created. And that money eventually gets circulating. And once again, the people who are going to suffer from all this welfareism and all this stuff, it's going to hit the middle class, the people who supported the financial spending, But the productivity will never keep up with the demands. The biggest threat, of course, will be getting into trouble and overseas, and the more loss of liberties. Just think of how under wartime conditions, they suspend the civil liberties. They did that all the way back in the Civil War period and other war. But a lot of times World War I was terrible protection of civil liberties, but most of it was reversed afterwards. The one thing about the perpetual war on the global war on terrorism, there's no suspension of war. It just goes on and on. They tried to curtail this after the Vietnam War with the War Powers Resolution, 1973. So they passed this in the Congress to make sure that the people had a say in this. They, not let a president do what they have done to go to war without really permission of the Congress. Well, it made it worse. It made it easier to go to war. What it did, it legalized war for 90 days. And then, if you suggest, the troops are in danger, you mean you'd cut some of the spending when the troops are in danger? How do you do it? And I said, it's simple. Just bring the troops home. So do it. But unfortunately, people are bent on, being involved, and they get convinced that we are a great nation. And in many ways, I look for the greatness of this country, and we had been, but we're not nearly as great as a lot of people think we are, because we're not leading in a proper manner. We're not leading in a moral way or sound money or a sensible foreign policy. The founders tried to give us advice on that. Stay out of entangling alliances overseas. Well, you know what that would mean if we did? We would have to get out of the United Nations. And I think NATO does no good for us. Robert Taft argued after the war not to get into NATO. He said, well, just invite us to get involved in issues that we shouldn't be involved. And sometimes in the earlier years, we'd get involved because NATO wanted us to. Now we own NATO, and we get NATO to rubber stamp what we want to do. And then if they don't do exactly what we want, we say, we're going to send you a bill, and you're going to have to pay for it. But NATO, we're in so many places. It's NATO that's stirring up the trouble in Eastern Europe. NATO in Ukraine, NATO and our governments and the British government all participate in these coups. They're worrying about collusion. I don't like collusion. Anybody who colludes, we ought to find out who they are and expose them. But the amount of collusion that went along with this last election, it is absolutely minuscule compared to what we have done as a country over the last 50 years. Our CIA has murdered more people and orchestrated overthrows of government. The worst coming from a person like Eisenhower, starting off in 1953, with Iran. That's still going on. But so far, Most Americans would have no idea about that. Most American people, when it comes to Iran, would be with Bill O'Reilly. One time, I had a little skirmish with Bill O'Reilly. Maybe I won that one. I don't know. Eventually, no. We were into this, and he was a hawk and wanted to do this and this and this. And I said, Bill, don't you know that in 1953, trying to explain to him, he said, I don't want to hear anything about history. Well, that's not too hard for a lot of American people, because in our public schools they're not getting very much about history, and that is part of the problem. That's why I happen to have a homeschooling program. Hopefully that people will find out what the real story is about. Thank you. But there is every reason to look on some positive side. First thing, the whole thing's coming down. And you say, well, that's terrible, isn't it? No, it gives you an opportunity. If it won't be repaired and you can't convert people, it will come down. You have a chance to rebuild it. Maybe when the monetary system fails, maybe we'll come to our senses. Monetary systems have failed for thousands of years because of the same reason. They abuse it. In the old days, it would be clipping coins and inflating and printing money, and now it's just using a computer. But it fails. And to restore soundness to that, inevitably, they've gone to something of substance, something that is tangible. They go back to gold. We did it ourselves in 1975. Lincoln took us off the gold standard, put us on the greenback standard, and by 1975, the consensus was with the American people, we want gold in our money. So they passed the Resumption Act, and a 3-year period of transition. The price of gold went back to $20 an ounce. It was a non-event, but we weren't fighting foreign wars. We didn't have a welfare state, and the people still believed the government wouldn't have run up these huge debts. See, we can't do that now because the deficits are going to continue. And that's why I've worked hard on trying to solve this problem and curtail government, is to offer the chance, a legal chance, for competing currencies to get out of the system. I want people to be able to get out of the educational system until we clean up the whole thing so that you can have private or homeschooling. I want people to get out of the medical system and not have any mandates, and I believe Rand Paul has helped us on that in getting rid of the mandate and let have choice. Legalize competition in currencies. And this obviously has opened, if we had that, this has opened up the door that some creative people believe there's, blockchain technology that you can use in cryptocurrencies, which I think still has time to decide, how successful it be or what not. But it needs to be, I say, legalize it, let it happen, let it be open, let it be voluntary, no fraud. That's what the problem has been with the government. So people cause creates fraud. So if they're in government, they're fraudulent, and they do it in the name of government. But people outside of government commit a lot of fraud too. So it is difficult. But I think that's why the 6,000 years of history, something tangible, if you want reassurance that there's no fraud going on, is that you're able to convert. But I believe that the gold standard restrains big government. There was one trip that I had. I was on the Gold Commission in the early 80s, and Ronald Reagan was president. And we were on our way to Houston, and we were going to fly out to Andrews. And I was with our delegation. But I was next door to the White House, and the White House invited me to fly on the helicopter. They knew I was at the Gold Commission. We fly from the White House out to Andrews Air Base. And it was really, I'd met Reagan a good many times, but never really had much of a conversation. But that flight, it was a one-on-one, and he had known I was coming from the Gold Commission. And two things I remember in our conversation as we were flying out of from the White House. We were looking down, and he looked down there, and he said, "Isn't that beautiful? All the monuments. Isn't it amazing how many horrible things come out of this country in such a beautiful place?" But the other thing he said, was, he knew my position on gold standard. He says, "Any great nation that has gone off the gold standard never remains great. So he may have been perceptive on that, but it's not that we went off the gold standard. The whole world has gone off the gold standard. And what we're facing these international crises, but we're facing a bubble that has never existed in the history of the world. Everything is a bubble. Never has a reserve currency, a paper currency, been so involved in a global economy. So there's not a lot of bubbles. There's just one very, very big bubble. And the plain truth is that debt has to be liquidated. And the debt is too big. It'll never be paid down. And that's why the Fed works very hard at liquidating debt through inflation. Devalue the dollar. If you can get rid of 75% of the value of the dollar from today on, you get rid of 75% of your debt. So the debt will be liquidated, but I don't think for a minute that all of a sudden we're going to have enough people in Congress to vote to cut enough spending where we actually pay down the debt. There's no way. The numbers aren't there. People are retiring, more numbers before. Less people, the millennials right now, don't have tremendous opportunities. It is stated now that the millennials who have a student debt are now in negative financial territory. They have no wealth at all. And those numbers are very, very serious. So that is the reason when you look at those numbers, to me, they look a lot more serious than some of the worries that we had back when the wars were going on, but because the system is being undermined. But I don't think it's that difficult to take care of. I got to watch my watch here, see where I am. I can't read the watch here. No, I think we have these opportunities. We need to know what we believe in. We need to know that we believe in liberty, and we have to not be despondent about it, because I really believe our numbers are growing. I think there's a better understanding on monetary policy and the need for non-intervention. In spite of the difficulty in figuring out exactly what our foreign policy is, when the right things are said, it's good, and we cling to those things. That right now, I think it's exciting. I've complained about Korea for a long, long time. I said, why do we have troops there? They were put in there when I was in high school. It's time to come home. Look at the money we're spending. And it looks like maybe there's a slight door opening there, and we should be cheered. The truth is, though, we have prevented that for so long. We would not ever encourage South Korea to talk to the North Koreans, and that has been a major problem. And now they are. I thought that was great, but I don't think that's the end of it yet. Those neocons, they don't give up easily. So, and we have to remember that, and we also have to remember that philosophically, our real challenge is going to be with the cultural Marxists who like chaos, whether it's economic or social chaos, and they'll attack their own people just to cause chaos. And believe me, it's not hard for them to do that, because they work from the point of view that authoritarian government is proper and necessary. But if you have a belief in liberty, you don't believe in force. And to me, the magnificent thing about a libertarian society is that it should bring people together, not divided, because not all of us have the same desires. I mean, just think of it in terms of religion and social habits and sexual habits. And if people aren't causing harm to anybody else, just let everybody pick and choose what they want to do with their lives. It's their lives. But the whole thing is, if they have money, they should be able to spend it the way they want. I think they should even be allowed to spend it overseas if they like. Spend their money the way they want. If they mess up, then they're responsible. But why shouldn't liberals and progressives now in Washington? I was able to work with Dennis Kucinich and others and say, we work together because we don't like the wars and we like civil liberties. But liberals, what about religious liberties? I bet you in this room there might be 100 different views on religious liberty, and some have no religion. But in liberty, everybody's permitted to do that. In economics, it should be that way. And treat other governments that same way. everybody should be clamoring to join us. And that's why I'm optimistic on the long run, but we have some rough spot. But I do thank everybody who has joined us and helped us and comes to conferences like this. This is encouraging. Some people thank me a whole lot, but I thank you for the support, because if you didn't come, I don't know what I'd be doing. Thank you very much.
Some years ago in my previous life, before I entered the nonprofit foundation advancing libertarianism world, I was a trial attorney in my native state of Texas, and I was practicing law in Dallas, and I guess I was around 33 or so, and I went to the University of Dallas, and I found the head of the economics department and asked him if I could contract with him, hire him, to tutor me in Austrian economics. So he says, well, show me what you've read, and I gave him my reading list, and he says, look, let's do this. Let's start from the beginning. Let's go to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and then we'll go from there. And so we did. We studied Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations chapter by chapter. We went to David Ricardo's Principles, John Stuart Mill, up through the works, The Principles of Economics by Karl Menger, who was the original Austrian economist promoter. And then we were getting to Ludwig von Mises' Human Action, and he says, well, I really like taking your money, but there's a guy coming into the department who's of your age group who knows more about Austrian economics than anybody in your age group. And that was Richard Ebeling. And so he says, I'm now turning you over to him. So I hired Richard to tutor me chapter by chapter in Human Action. We would meet every Friday afternoon, and then we would adjourn for lunch. So it was a great experience. I mean, I really owe to Richard the foundation that I have in Austrian economics. He was teaching at the University of Dallas. From there, he went to Hillsdale College, where he became the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics. I went on to the Foundation for Economic Education, gave up the practice of law in New York. And then 2 years later, I started FFF. And Richard, from the very beginning, was right there, helping me put together the foundation. He was the vice president of academic affairs for FFF, wrote a monthly article for our journal, Future of Freedom, for many, many years. And we put on programs like this together. And then one year he got nominated and selected as president of the Foundation for Economic Education, where I'd been serving as program director. And so he remained president of FEE. And then later he went on to the Citadel right here in Charleston. And it's just really, I'm a graduate of Virginia Military Institute, and I wish VMI would move in this direction, but there seems to be little signs of that. But Richard is the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership at the Citadel. He's a through and through libertarian teaching at this institution. He tells me there's other people there that are being hired at the Citadel. It's a real testament to this school that they're opening up, the students' minds to this philosophy, both in terms of economics and foreign policy. And Richard is the co-author of many books, or the editor of many books, some of which have been published by FFF. One that we're really proud of is The Failure of America's Foreign Wars, that y'all all get a free copy of. We published that many, many years ago, and it's timeless. It'll apply today. And Richard also authored a book called Monetary Central Planning in the State for FFF that I think you'll love. It's about the Federal Reserve. And then another one most recently, Austrian Economics and Public Policy, along with, I think it's a 6-part video series that explain the fundamentals of the principles of economics. So it's been a real highlight of my life to have Richard Ebeling not only working with us, he's working with us again at FFF. He does a weekly article that we publish. He and I do a weekly internet show, a video show called The Libertarian Angle that I would invite you to listen to or watch. And or subscribe to our FFF Daily, and you get it in there every week. And so it's been a real pleasure to not only to have Richard working with us at FFF and bringing these great ideas to people that are supporting our work and subscribing to our work, but also just our personal friendship. Richard Ebeling.
Not too long ago, a conservative Republican wheeled himself into a bar. He was paralyzed from the waist down. And he wheels himself to a table. The waiter comes up, and he orders a beer. And the beer is brought, and the conservative looks over into the corner of the bar and says, "Isn't that Jesus Christ?" And the waiter, the bartender, says, "Yes, that's Jesus." And the conservative says, "Well, you send over a beer to him and tell Jesus it's on me." Shortly after that, a libertarian comes into the bar, and he's hobbling on a walker, and his spine is crooked, and he has a hump on his shoulder, and he hobbles over to a table. Bartender, the waiter comes up. "Let me have a glass of wine." A glass of wine comes, and he too looks in the same corner and says, "Isn't that Jesus?" "Yep," bartender says, that's Jesus. "Will you send Jesus a glass of wine over and tell him it's from me?" Then a modern liberal Democrat comes in. And he has a cast on his leg, and he has a cane, and he gets over to a table, and again the bartender comes, and he orders a shot of whiskey. And bartender comes back with it, and the liberal Democrat says, "Isn't that the supposedly supernatural person, sometimes referred to as God Jesus?" Yep, that's Jesus. "Well, you send over to that maybe supernatural being, Jesus, and give him a shot of whiskey and tell him it's on me." Shortly after that, Jesus gets up and comes up to the conservative Republican, and he says, "Because of your kindness and thoughtfulness, I touch you, and you are healed." And suddenly, whatever the paralysis was from the waist down that was forcing this conservative to be in the wheelchair is gone. And he jumps out of the wheelchair, "Hallelujah, praise the Lord," and he runs out of the bar. Jesus goes up to the libertarian and says, "Because of your thoughtfulness and kindness, I touch you, and you are healed." And his spine is straightened, and the hump is off his shoulder. And the libertarian yells, "Hallelujah, praise the Lord," as he too runs out of the bar. And then he goes up to the modern liberal Democrat, and he says, "For your thoughtfulness and kindness, and just before he can finish, the Democrat says, "Please don't touch me, I'm on government disability." It is a pleasure to be here with you today. It's particularly a pleasure to have been on a program with Ron Paul. Excuse me, I've known Ron Paul actually from about the time when I met Jacob Hornberger in the mid-1980s. I had taken this job at the University of Dallas, and while Ron Paul was a congressman from the Houston district, if you were conservative or libertarian, in spite of its size, Texas was politically kind of a small state. And one story I should mention, since he was talking about some of his experiences in Congress and the attitudes of his colleagues there. Shortly after I met Ron, I said, "Ron, when you entered Congress for the first time, what surprised you the most?" And Ron thought for a moment. He said, "The fact that if I made two statements in the well of the Congress, my colleagues either laughed at me or ignored me." And he said the two statements were in relation to any bill coming before the House. It's immoral or it's unconstitutional. Using either one of those arguments, it's immoral or unconstitutional, will result in no one in the rest of the House, or virtually none, taking him seriously. That is the state of American politics for decades now. Now, I cannot have let pass, at least elaborating slightly on Jacob's comments about how we met back in the 1980s. It is true I had taken a job at the University of Dallas, and I had taught a little bit, but this was really like one of my first really full-time regular teaching positions. So I was assigned classes I hadn't normally taught. There's a lot of lesson plan preparation, the syllabus for the class. But he came up to me and he said, "I'd like for you to tutor me in Ludwig von Mises's Human Action." I was a little hesitant, the workload. And then he told me the fee he'd pay me. No problem. Now, I'm being paid to perform a service. I want to be conscientious. So I start meticulously going through, again, the chapters in Human Action, making out little outlines for myself. And I would start the sessions trying to summarize so we could then discuss. About halfway through each session, he would get off Austrian economics, and he'd want to test me. Well, where do you stand on this issue and that issue? How libertarian am I? Do I leak? And so, the bulk of the conversation would be about our political views. And then, as he mentioned, we would then go out, and he usually would treat me to lunch at a local, very good Mexican restaurant. Now, you have no idea how depressed I became when, I guess about a year and a half, 2 years later, he tells me that he is taking this job at the Foundation for Economic Education as program director. He's leaving Dallas. Here I've had this great gig, good pay, no work, and a free lunch. I was so depressed that he was leaving. But Jacob and I obviously have known each other for a very long time, and it is always a pleasure to be continuing to participate with him in programs like this. We do the Libertarian Angle once a week as a YouTube video on the issues of the day. I write a regular article which appears on the website, and that sort of gets to the importance of today's theme, and that is non-intervention. Now, the classical liberal, the libertarian, believes strongly in the principle of non-intervention. But what does this mean? It means that government should not be intervening in the affairs of human beings when it does not involve one private citizen aggressing on the rights of another. Each individual is born, classical liberals, libertarians, conservatives in general, believe that each is born with certain inherent natural rights. Thomas Jefferson spoke about it in the Declaration of Independence, did he not? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the idea is, Jefferson goes on after those famous words, that governments are formed among men to secure and protect those liberties. And that is fundamentally the only purpose, rationale, justification for government. The establishment of an agency over a territory in which it has legitimized authority to use force and compulsion. Only if it is securing our liberties and not violating them can we say that the actions of a government, as reflecting the wishes of the people to have their rights secured, is justified and should be viewed by the people as legitimate. Now, that means in the domestic affairs of a society that each of us is free to live our lives as we peacefully and voluntarily choose, as long as we respect those equivalent rights of others. I choose my own values, my own purposes, my own goals. I decide what are the most important and useful means and methods to try to attain them. Now, no man is an island, and there's very little that we can do in blissful, economic, self-sufficient isolation to attain all the goals, purposes, and ends that we want to attain. So we form social relationships, associations, interactions with others. We call this, in general, the market economy. There's the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. Each of us finds a niche, a corner, a specialization in which to participate in the social system of division of labor in a market economy, in which we apply our knowledge, our abilities, our skills that we have intuitively have or acquired to make something that others will take in trade from us in exchange for what they can do, either better than us or that we can't do for ourselves at all. And through that voluntary exchange, we mutually benefit each other. That is the basis from a freedom point of view of all human relationships. Personal freedom, secured liberty, and voluntary and peaceful association and interaction with other human beings. It is only when one individual violates the rights of another through violence of murder, theft, fraud, that the government then has a role to come in. The reasons and the rationales and the justifications were explained long ago by the Founding Fathers, and before them, in the modern version, by the famous British philosopher John Locke. But that is the purpose of government, and that is the rationale in the domestic affairs of a nation of non-intervention. It only intervenes in the negative sense, to protect a person's liberty or to secure justice after a person's rights have been violated. anything else is to take from some that they honestly have earned or acquired, and to take it from them without their consent to redistribute or give to another. And that includes that blatant form of taking from Peter to give to Paul, to the use of the regulatory state, the interventionist intrusion state, such agencies as the Federal Reserve, through the redistribution of wealth through inflation. All of these would be unjustifiable forms of intervention. And therefore, the advocate of liberty is for non-intervention in all such affairs. But what about foreign policy? What does it mean when the classical liberal, the libertarian, many conservatives say that they believe in non-intervention in foreign affairs as well? Well, it basically was the principles and the ideas upon which the country was both founded and operated for a good part of its early history. And that is, the attitude is that a government protects the rights of the individual. It doesn't violate them. Now, there can be domestic bandits, thieves, corrupt fraudsters, murderers, and so government secures us domestically from that. And sometimes there can be bandits, thieves, murderers, and conquerors attempting to enter the territory of your country and plunder and enslave and kill and rob you. And just as domestic police are meant to protect negatively your rights from the aggressions of private citizens in that country, the role of the government in the sense of military is to negatively protect you from an invasion, an attack, or a clearly and obvious imminent threat. But if there is no such imminent threat or clear and evident attack, the U.S. government has no business intervening in the affairs of other nations around the world. Why? Well, first of all, it's one thing to say that country X has invaded your country. They've invaded the country. They're threatening or killing the citizens of that country. They're seizing or plundering or destroying the property of the peaceful citizens of that country. Certainly, most people in that country would see the self-evident obviousness and clearness of the government then acting as a national defense agency to repel and resist and oppose such an attack. But once the government goes beyond that and proceeds to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, there's no certainty of such basic unanimity of agreement about what the government is doing and why. The fact is that since the Second World War, the United States has undertaken a variety of foreign interventions, both political, economic, and certainly military. Congressman Paul mentioned some of them: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. But we've intervened in overthrowing governments, undermining governments, subsidizing opposition groups in other countries. My gosh, we have attempted to influence elections in other countries. I am shocked. I am shocked. Yes. Now, when there is no such unanimity, because it does not involve the protection of the rights of that nation's own citizens, it means a divisiveness among the people. Think of Vietnam, which, again, Dr. Paul mentioned. The Vietnam was virtually divisive from the start. There were many who felt, oh, you know, the communist threat has to be held back. We have to intervene. They talked about dominoes. If Vietnam falls, all of Southeast Asia will fall like a series of dominoes. And we have to show that we mean business. But at the same time, in the United States, there was an extended amount of opposition resistance by people who said, why are we going there? Why are we conscripting, that's just forcefully imposing military service upon tens of thousands of Americans and sending them over to participate and fight a war which many of those people did not either agree with or understand, or didn't even have a clue as to what value or gain would come from it? There were demonstrations, there was violence on campuses, on the streets of America. In fact, that was the worst divisiveness in the country since the Civil War of exactly 100 years earlier. There's also the fact that the American military forces were put into harm's way in ways that could not be justified if one believed in those principles of liberty, to say that you were directly protecting and securing the rights of American citizens from a foreign attack. That was 10,000 miles away on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And then there was the fact of what was the result of it? Is this what the people of that country wanted? Now, there were certainly people in Vietnam who opposed Ho Chi Minh's regime in the north. But the fact there were many Vietnamese who just didn't want any form of foreign intervention. The French had been a colonial power there from the 1880s until 1954 and had acted very brutally and callously during its colonial years. The United States then came in when the French withdrew and then gave military and political and economic support to South Vietnam and seemed to be just another colonial intervener for its own global purposes. So there's the divisiveness of it, the cost of it. All of these raise questions and doubts as to the purpose of it. Now, if a classical liberal, libertarian, some conservatives take this view, the response many times, not just from the very hawkish neoconservatives, but many well-intentioned and reasonable conservatives as well. Are there not bad things going on in the world around us? Yes, there are. Are there not tyrants and dictators and brutal rulers who do awful things to their own peoples in the name of maintaining their own power and plundering their own country? Absolutely. Are there situations where country X is threatening country Y, and country Y may seem to be the victim and the innocent subject or nation in this instance? Absolutely. Don't you care about helping people abroad who are suffering from liberty when you say you believe in liberty? Aren't you concerned with thwarting the aggression of a bad country against an innocent people in a neighboring land from that aggressor? Yes. But that does not involve the government. Now, the analogy that I sometimes make is that what is it when we see bad things happening in our own society? What is the classical liberal, libertarian, or conservative position usually? It is not that the government should redistribute wealth. It is not that the government should try to socially determine how people act and live. It is not that government should regulate the society. In a free society, if there are others in that society who you see following bad, harmful, or negative paths in their own lives, then the freedom principle says that you have the following ways to influence and try to assist them: reason, persuasion, the example of your own life, of a better path to follow, and to form charitable associations, philanthropic groups, when the financial cost and the just time and effort may involve more than what one person or one or two people can do in outreach to assist those that they may feel have fallen about hard times, have made bad choices, need a second chance and a helping hand. But it is inappropriate in a free society for the state, the political authority, the government, to play the moral arbiter of how and in what form some in society should give assistance to others. First of all, to do so undermines the principle of ethics. If the government taxes us, regulates us to live morally, righteously, better, then what happens to our ability to exercise and develop our own moral conscience? Not only our moral conscience of making the decisions in our own lives to live a different way or not, but charity itself. It is uncharitable. It is undermining the philanthropic spirit when the government takes your money compulsorily from your pocket and gives it to another in the name of assisting them. It desensitizes us. It makes us callous. I paid my taxes. It's not my problem. The government should be providing that health care. The government should be taking care of the old. The government should be. The government should be. It undermines our own sense of moral responsibility in the most reasonable and ethical and right way in a free society that should fall upon and work on the conscience of a free person. what we call the associations of mutual assistance of civil society. It also involves the usurpation of people's wealth, because it really isn't the taking of Peter's wealth to give to Paul. It's taking Peter's wealth and redistributing it to politicians and bureaucrats with political authority, and them then deciding how the money will be spent. On what? What is a good cause? What is a just cause? What is a better cause? With the underlying result being is that then you have politicized the determination of how wealth shall be used, rather than free individuals having control over their own income that they have peacefully and honestly earned. Now, I would argue that the same things, the same underlying principles, if what I've said has any validity or truthful ethical sense to it, in foreign affairs. If bad things happen in other countries, but it does not involve an attack on the United States and therefore a justifiable national defense against an aggressor, then it falls upon the private choices and actions of the American citizens to decide what their conscience leads them to do. It could be to go and personally assist in a cause in another country, to join and participate in a resistance movement against some other nation's domestic dictator, or to thwart an invasion by another country in that foreign land, to volunteer yourself, to do so for free or for pay, to give charitably to support philanthropic efforts, whether it be medical supplies or helping refugees, or even to contribute private money to help armaments for those who you view as threatened and oppressed. If that sounds awkward or strange, with the recent conflicts in the Middle East, particularly involving Islamic State, a big brouhaha was made by sympathizers of Islamic State leaving Europe or the United States clandestinely because their governments said it was illegal, and going to Iraq and Syria and joining the Islamic State. The Islamic State was theological totalitarianism, an imposition on the mind and the body of a narrow and dogmatic conception of religious faith, belief, and conduct. But that was their choice. But what was not given as much public notice in the press, though there were a handful of articles about it, were the admittedly smaller number of Europeans and Americans who went to fight against the Islamic State with the resisting forces in Iraq and particularly Syria. Americans, Brits, a handful of French and Germans. That was their right too, to voluntarily as private citizens to go and oppose Islamic State. And to my mind, the U.S. government should in no way hinder or prevent or restrict individuals from leaving the territorial jurisdiction of the United States and as private citizens, with all the risks that involved as a private citizen, to do so, whether they supported or opposed the cause. We've seen this before. Some of you remember from history the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. There was a left-of-center Republican government in Spain in 1936. There arose a military rebellion against it, led by a general named Francisco Franco. He labeled himself a fascist. He gained the diplomatic and even military support of Mussolini's fascist Italy and Hitler's Nazi Germany. Italian soldiers came to fight for Franco. German airplanes fought for Franco. But people felt a moral calling. And admittedly, most of them who went to fight the fascists in Spain as private citizens were on the left. They were socialists and some communists. But that's their ideology, and they're going as a private citizen. And they formed the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and the George Washington Brigade, and thousands of them came from the United States and fought against the fascists in Spain as private citizens. Many of them died. I'm sure most of you are familiar with George Orwell, who wrote the famous, futuristic anti-hero novel, 1984. He also wrote a book called Homage to Catalonia. He was a correspondent. He went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and he witnessed this. And he wrote against both the contemptible brutality of Franco and the fascists, but also the contemptible and totalitarian actions of the communists as well on the other side. But what he brought out is that the Americans who were there, even though he ideologically did not agree with him, Orwell was sort of like a middle-of-the-road socialist, not a communist. But he said they were there by their own choice, however naively, given how Stalin's secret agents treated them, who were supporting the anti-fascists. But you see, the important thing here is that these were private individuals acting on their conscience, going back earlier. Inspired by the American movement for independence, in the 1820s there emerged the freedom revolutions in South America against Spanish rule. We all maybe have heard of Simón Bolívar, who led these revolutions in various parts of Latin America to overthrow Spanish rule. Well, there were a handful of Americans, private citizens, who went to fight with Simón Bolívar against Spanish colonialism in Latin America. Why? Some of them were adventures, the excitement of it. Others were idealism, overthrow an imperial power, let the people of Latin America be free societies and hopefully be democratic like we're trying to have in the United States. And some were mercenaries. Some of them actually did it for money. And though I've not seen it, I've read that there are, in fact, in some places in Latin America, statues to some of these Americans who actually fought with Simón Bolívar as recognition for their private individual assistance in the cause of their national freedoms. That is the policy and perspective that should be the hallmark of the United States and what the government should not do and the free citizens of the country should and be allowed to do. What is moral and ethical about this? You feel a calling to support some side in a foreign civil war or just a war between the countries, you do so. But that does not mean that you can force, and you're not forcing, the rest of the citizens of the country of the United States to fund fighting for your supported cause or sending American soldiers to support the cause that you support. Let me give one instance that is a volatile one and has been for decades. The Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, we have significant communities in the United States of Americans who are of the Jewish faith, and we have Arabs, Muslims, who have lived in the United States, who are American citizens. Some take these issues seriously. There are Americans of the Jewish faith and American Muslims who feel strongly about the Israeli cause or the Palestinian cause. The United States government gives $3 billion a year in foreign aid to Israel. A lot of Arab Americans resent this. It's partly their tax dollars, is it not? Why should their tax dollars go to support Israel? On the other hand, there are some Jewish Americans who are equally resentful. Why do we give $3 billion to Egypt, which we do through foreign aid and military assistance, and a variety of other Arab countries, all of whom, either in the past or even up to the present, have called, either officially or unofficially, for the destruction of Israel? Why should they have to fund foreign aid of an economic or military type to these Arab countries who have declared a death wish on Israel? If a private citizen who, by choice or accident of birth, is either Muslim or Jewish, you give your own private money. But it should not be the responsibility of the government to take the wealth of all of us and divvy it out to foreign governments to support causes that various groups of the United States population may disagree with. Another example is Turkey is part of NATO, and we have been giving military assistance for many years. Well, there is a sizable Armenian community in the United States, okay? And there are some Kurds who live in the United States. The Armenians were slaughtered by the Turks early on in the 20th century. The Turks have always denied the right of Armenian self-determination in the Armenian part of eastern Turkey. And the Turkish government has brutally oppressed all attempts for national freedom by the Kurds. They're doing it right now. They have intervened into the territory of Syria to try to crush the Kurdish military that has been very successful in fighting against Islamic State, because they think that's a symbol of the right of Kurdish national self-determination. If you're a Kurd or an Armenian who happens to be an American, having been born there, is this your family heritage, and you disagree with Turkish policy, why should your tax dollars have to support the Turkish government? Why should American military personnel through NATO, in principle, be obligated to come to the defense of a Turkish government if you feel strongly against the policies of that Turkish government? That is a radical non-intervention foreign policy that should be the hallmark of the United States. Are there threats? In principle, should there be a military and a national defense against real aggressors who might threaten the United States? Yes, of course. And the size of the military should be commensurate with the real and objective threats against the territorial integrity and the lives and property of the citizenry, which has objectively little to do with the size, scope, and cost of what the United States government spends today on the defense budget and military bases and the stationing of tens of thousands of soldiers all around the world, as if they're garrisoning an American empire. The true philosophy of freedom applied to foreign policy is defense for the protection of the territory and the rights of American citizens, and all other matters are the private choices and decisions of the citizenry to be guided by their conscience to either support causes of their own choice in various and sundry ways, but not to draw all of the people in to support a cause that you may think is right and just, but other Americans do not. Any more than it is right domestically that because you think this is a good cause, other Americans should be taxed and have their wealth redistributed by the compulsion of the state to support a program or an activity or a group that you consider to be deserving. It should all be based upon voluntary giving, freedom of choice, mutual agreement, individual decision-making, and the respect of the rights of others. That should be the policy at home and the policy abroad. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm really grateful to Professor Ebeling for really helping us understand the intellectual framework of non-interventionism. I think it was perfect timing to really lay out what it means philosophically and intellectually. And I'm actually happy because it helps me, because I want to talk about some more practical aspects of it, some real-world aspects of it. So it works well. But I should start by saying, it's funny, last April, we did a conference with the Mises Institute, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We did a conference in April down in Lake Jackson, of all places. And just a couple of days before the conference started, President Trump decided to lob a few missiles into Syria over an alleged chemical weapons attack, gas attack on his people. So when Bumper called up and said, we should do a conference, let's do it in April, I thought, I don't know. And then here we go. Just a couple of weeks after President Trump lobbed some missiles into Syria, here we are meeting again. So I'm making a vow I will never have another April conference because I care too much about the poor Syrians. So there's one thing that I always do at conferences, and I don't know, maybe people find it annoying, but I find, because I'm really driven by the news cycle, that it helps us sort of center ourselves where we are right now, where we stand, what's happening in the world. And what I do is I just simply read the headlines from one of my favorite sites, which you all know, antiwar.com. And these are just a few of their headlines. And just to kind of put us where we are, this is what's happening this morning. Korea's agree to work toward peace, no nukes. Full text of joint declaration issued at Inter-Korean Summit. Trump encouraged by Korea Summit. Upbeat about meeting Kim. Mattis, French special forces aiding U.S. in Syria. U.S. and Turkey agree to work toward deal on Manbij. It's in Syria. Pompeo says Trump, quote, unlikely to stay in Iran deal. Mattis defends Iran deal as Trump mulls withdrawing. Israel forces kill 3 Gaza border protesters, wound 600. CIA director nominee will promise not to resume torture. Okay. Trump threatens allies who oppose U.S. World Cup bid. So that's where we are this morning. We should just sort of keep up with those things, and that gives you sort of the gamut of what's happening. Now, I almost called up Jacob yesterday because I was in the depths of despair. I almost called him up and said, we need to call this conference off. Because I put on Zero Hedge, and here is the headline. Most popular politician in America. 63% have a positive view of this person, according to Quinnipiac University. South Carolina's own Nikki Haley. So you know where the neocons are going for 2020. They just can't wait to get her in. And someone wrote to me once, they said, we're so fortunate down here in South Carolina to be rid of her. Unfortunately, the U.S. is stuck with her. So, but what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a derivative of what Professor Ebeling talked about, and that is the idea of war propaganda and the manipulation of language to promote war propaganda. And I've called my talk, and I like the title, War Propaganda, the Mother of All Wars. And I think that's really true. I think of war propaganda as an intelligence official might call it, or military official might call it, the intelligence preparation of battlefield. Propaganda, manipulation of the way we use language about other nations prepares us mentally, prepares people mentally for war. So it's very, very important, and that's the reason that the neocons very early on, try to manipulate the way we talk about countries. So what I'm going to do is go through sort of a general introduction on how this works, and then I'm going to go through just a few of the recent wars. I'm going to be very brief, but how propaganda, how the manipulation of language, operates in there. So the first thing about language manipulation, and I'm not going to use any names because the 2 examples I'm telling you are people that I do respect very much, and I would hate to use their names, but I think it's very illustrative of what we're trying to say. One very prominent progressive, you would all know the name, no question about it, a very good writer, widely viewed as anti-war, and I still read this person very much. But in response to the recent alleged gas attack in Duma in Syria, his response was to the effect of, and this is through Twitter, Assad is a monster who probably gassed his own people, but I don't support U.S. action against him. That's problematic because you concede a lot of the language that the neocons use, a lot of the language that the war machine uses. Well, he probably did it. It prepares people mentally and intellectually for what follows. And the other is a prominent libertarian intellectual who, again, I won't name because this person I have a lot of respect for, but we had a bit of a dust-up recently because of the issue of North Korea. And there seems to be this idea that when discussing North Korea, maybe it's changed over the last couple of days, but you have to begin with, oh, it's an absolute prison state. People are dying and eating grass and eating each other. It's the worst state in the history of the world. You have to use that before you can say, but we shouldn't do anything about it. And whether it's true or not, none of us know. We have not been there. We don't live there. We don't know what it's like. Knowing what we do know about planned economies, it probably leaves a lot to be desired. But conceding the idea that all of these terrible things have happened, but we shouldn't do anything about it, it opens the door for a criticism that you just don't care, or that there's something wrong with you if you believe this person is gassing his people, if you believe it's the worst state in the history of the world. This individual sent me and said, well, would we not be allowed to denounce the Great Terror, the crimes of communism? Why should we not preface our statements about North Korea with these kinds of comments? And I always remember what Lew Rockwell says in these situations, a great libertarian orator and intellectual. He says, is whoever the enemy of the day is he a monster? Yeah, he's a politician. He's definitely a monster. But I refuse to participate in the regime, in the neocon, in the interventionist demonization of the enemy of the week, of the enemy of the day. I refuse to participate in it. I refuse to adopt the language they want me to adopt to help the neocons push their propaganda. So I think it's very important, the use of language in propaganda. Now, Professor Ebeling was very interesting when he talked about how the one nation perceived strong attacking a weak nation and how that motivates us. We don't like seeing that the underdog is under threat. It motivates us to want to have action, and that's what the neocons, of course, and the interventionists prey on. Oh, poor such and such. How can we stand by and watch that? But a lot of this is deception, acts of deception and perception management. The first instance I want to talk about is Gulf War I. A couple of very interesting, and many of you I do already know about this, but in the lead up to Gulf War I, Representative Tom Lantos, the late Tom Lantos, the liberal interventionist from California, he held hearings on Capitol Hill. And he brought in, as many of you know, a witness, a Kuwaiti witness, who told the Congressional Human Rights Committee, remember those words, human rights, because there's another deception. The Congressional Human Rights Committee, that Saddam Hussein's troops were throwing babies from incubators and leaving them to die on the ground. She was tearful when she told the story, and it motivated members of Congress. It enraged members of Congress, and it was used by those who wanted war against Iraq. It was used to get people on board, to come over the hump from being opposed to war, which most Americans naturally are, and going into the other camp. Well, as we know now, Naira was her name, and she was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. She was set up by Hill & Knowlton, a huge public relations firm. Tom Lantos knew who she was, but he did not tell his fellow colleagues about it. He did not tell the other members of Congress that she was the daughter of the ambassador. He knew he was setting up a deception to convey the sense that a big, mean, nasty country was beating up on a little country because he wanted war and he wasn't afraid to lie about it. Well, what happened with Lantos? Well, he also had a Congressional Human Rights Foundation. The Human Rights Committee was part of Congress, so they couldn't receive donations, but he also had a little foundation on the side, interestingly enough. And this is from the New York Times article back in '92 when they exposed what happened. They had subsidized rent at the headquarters of Hill & Knowlton down in D.C. That's interesting. Nice digs. And when the war finally broke out, Lantos's little foundation received $50,000 from the Kuwaiti government. Interesting. Second little vignette from Gulf War I, the baby milk factory. Many of you remember that as well. Peter Arnett from CNN visited after the U.S. bombed a facility that it claimed was chemical weapons. The Iraqis said it's a baby milk factory. Everyone laughed, ha, Saddam, he's so crazy, so dangerous, he's lying, it's so obvious. Peter Arnett goes down and he reports from the scene. This is going to seem familiar to a lot of you when we get to Syria. He reports from the scene. So I looked around everywhere. It kind of looks like a baby milk factory. They may have been doing other things there that I don't know about, but it really kind of looks like it's a baby milk factory. So what happened? He was brutally attacked. Some of you remember Marlon Fitzwater. He was one of the early person who was paid to lie regularly. He was a spokesperson for the president. He said, Peter Arnett's reporting about this is really not helpful to the U.S. government. And he says, he's playing into the hands of Saddam Hussein. That's what he said about. So going there and revealing that we actually did bomb, and as we know now, as it turns out, as the years have passed, it indeed was that. And not only did we bomb that, we bombed all of the infrastructure of Iraq. We bombed the sewage treatment facilities, so on and so on, to the point where we have the famous scene of Madeleine Albright talking about how the deaths of so many children were worth it. We intentionally, we didn't do it. I made a mistake. The U.S. government did it. So that's deception and propaganda to get people toward war. Now let's move on to the Iraq War 2.0. 2002, 2003. And I just want to talk about a little part of the deception because we could probably spend an hour or so talking about the deception. But let's talk about quote-unquote public diplomacy. That was such a key figure in the run-up to the war. Remember back at the time, the State Department hired Charlotte Beers to be its Undersecretary of State for Perception Management, Public Diplomacy. Who was she? Was she an expert in diplomacy, foreign affairs? Did she have a master's in international relations? No. She was known as, quote, the Queen of Madison Avenue. We laughed about it at the time. She sold Uncle Ben's rice. She sold Head & Shoulders shampoo to people. That was her job. Her job was to let you know that if you got dandruff, you got to buy this shampoo. That's what she did. And she went and she used those skills that she developed on Madison Avenue in the advertising agency, the PR agencies, to package and sell a war to people. She was the head of Ogilvy and Mather, one of the biggest PR firms, and J. Walter Thompson. She sold the war like shampoo to the American people. And at the same time, over at the Pentagon, we saw the emergence of Victoria Clark, a Hill and Knowlton executive. She was also in charge of PR and public perception management for the Pentagon side. What did she do? She brought in a group of regular meeting PR experts to figure out, how do we sell this war? How do we keep the American people from questioning or seeing the effects of this war? This is what they did. You all remember John Rendon and the Rendon Group. He was a big PR person, big PR company in the Beltway. He literally created the Iraqi National Congress. They decided, Ahmad Chalabi, you're our guy. This is it. And so they went and they created a government for Iraq out of thin air. So what did Victoria Clark do back at the Pentagon that I think is so critical to what we're talking about today? She developed a system where only pro-war journalists could cover the war. They called it embedding the journalists. They were not going to let anyone go on a Pentagon trip, at least not more than once, if when they came back they reported that the whole thing was a disaster. So she was one of the founders of the idea that only the people who were in favor of the war could cover the war. So what did we get? We got good news stories. How many times until later on, it wasn't until later on that we saw the highway of death, we saw the charred bodies of the soldiers trying to flee, not trying to fight. So she prevented that from happening. Okay, let's go to Libya now. Honest show of hands. If there is one, I'm going to be really surprised. It'll ruin my whole thing, so don't raise your hand. Whoever's heard the name Solomon Boishwiger? Good, nobody raised their hand. Okay, he was the head of the Libyan League for Human Rights. There's that word again. It was a UN NGO, an NGO that's tied with the United Nations. They all work together. What did he do? He put a petition together to the UN Human Rights Council. This is a grouping of NGOs. He had 70 NGOs sign it. And in that petition to the Human Rights Council, he claimed that Gaddafi had killed 6,000 people, was murdering people willy-nilly, destroying his own population. This guy has got to be stopped. He invoked the horrible, horrible policy of responsibility to protect, which is really the last nail in the coffin of anything good about the United Nations. This was a sovereignty-violating idea. So 70 NGOs signed it. They said, how'd you get them to do this? Well, we're all real close, so it was really easy. After he did that, Libya was suspended from the Human Rights Council. And because they were suspended, and on the strength of that petition, the issue was referred to the United Nations Security Council, the UNSC, which can invoke an Article 7 resolution. Article 7 allows for the use of force. And that's exactly what happened. As we remember, it wasn't that long ago. UNSC Resolution 1973 established the no-fly zones. Really was the last nail in the coffin, was an open door for the U.S. and its NATO allies, bombs away. Well, interestingly enough, afterwards, a French filmmaker called Julien Thiel, who was a really fascinating guy you haven't heard of. I've met him, and he's an interesting and wonderful guy. He went back and talked to Solomon. Ask him about this. What is with this petition? How did you do it? How did you quantify these claims that you made in the petition? He said, we got all our evidence from the rebels. They told us all this stuff. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it, going back to Syria? And he pushed him on, you could see it on camera. I think it's probably still available on YouTube, the film. He said, well, how did you get the evidence for this? How did you get the evidence? And Solomon, this guy became a little bit aggressive. He said, there is no evidence. So here you have it, a horrific war that the Libyans are still suffering from. It's all based on lies and propaganda, and this is just one aspect of it. And now we're finding out, of course, that a lot of the war was because Sarkozy was trying to cover up the fact that Gaddafi had given him a few $million for his campaign. So let's kind of fast forwarding now to Syria, and let's just focus on the 2 gas attacks. Although we should know that Syria was a regime change target. You could say 2006. I've seen 1985. There's plenty of stuff. I like 2006 because we've seen the WikiLeaks cable from the U.S. Embassy in Damascus, where the U.S. political officer reported back to Main State in Washington, here is how we can do a regime change against Assad. This is 2006. Interestingly enough, right around the time that Syria was on a charm offensive in the U.S. And actually, I was invited by the Syrian ambassador, along with a group of congressional aides, to go to his house and have dinner and talk about how can we improve relations, what can we do, how can we do this. So this was a part of the charm offensive. So here we have this roadmap in 2006, and it was everything that we saw from 2011 on. Radicalize people in parts of Syria. Get radical Islam in there, cause them to, the most radical elements to destabilize the government, try to focus on the sectarian divisions in society and exacerbate them. That's exactly what happened. They had agreed. The battle was over. They were essentially getting on the buses. And all of a sudden, once again, Assad wakes up and says, I've got to gas some women and children. This is what we're expected to believe. In the heat of the battle, he didn't drop gas on the soldiers, on the rebels. No, he didn't do that. As they were leaving, he didn't gas the rebels. No, he didn't gas a single rebel. He just decided to gas the civilians, the women and children. And we're seeing now more and more that this narrative that we're being told is breaking down. The tale that they're telling us is breaking down. So President Trump decides to shoot over about 106 missiles, just to show who's boss, but not to do too much damage, although there are 2 arguments for that. I won't get into it. But we're talking about $1 billion. Add up the cost of the missiles, add up the cost of flying the airplanes, of moving the airplanes, add up the cost of moving the fleet, of moving the ships around. You're talking about $1 billion spent that night. You can't tell me that couldn't have been spent on better things. Finally, North Korea. Kim is crazy. The guy's a nut. We can't do business with him. He's totally unstable. He only listens to force. He only understands force. Lurid tales about life in North Korea, like we said. This is the language you have to speak in. Well, I think he's a total nut, total crazy. He likes killing his own people, but we shouldn't bomb him. This is the trap that we're seeing now. He doesn't seem all that irrational, does he? He's been willing to negotiate. He's willing to meet. And in fact, no thanks to us, to be quite honest, they're moving quickly toward ending the war. If Dr. Paul were still here, he would probably give a lot of credit, and I think credit is due, to sports diplomacy, because I think the Olympics had a lot to do with the thaw between the 2 countries. Plus, I think it was something whose time had come. The election of Moon Jae-in in South Korea as someone to bring back the sunshine policy of negotiations with the North was a big help too. So what do I mean with all of this? Well, something really interesting is happening now, because we've had at the time of the early Gulf War, there was the mainstream media control over the narrative. But now they're losing control of the narrative. And now that they are losing control of the narrative, they are much more aggressively clamping down on dissent. Those of us who say what I just said, I don't believe what they claim about Syria. I don't believe it happened that way. There's nothing. You talk about motive. You talk about anything else. I don't believe. If you do that, you are a very bad person. The crackdown is very vicious. And how do they do it? Well, I would call it the military-industrial congressional think tank complex. It has a lot to do with it, and it's round and round you go, because the military defense industries fund the think tanks. You look at something like the Institute for the Study of War. It's the Kagan outfit. funded by the Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. Look at CSIS, funded by Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, et cetera, et cetera. The military companies fund the think tanks. The think tanks come up with papers saying we have to intervene. Those papers then go, of course, to Congress, where they're heavily lobbied by the military, military industry, and round you go. But you also have something that's interesting now that's happening, which is what you'd call the gongos, the government-organized, government-funded NGOs also attacking. In this, you may have heard some of these, the Atlantic Council, funded by governments and funded by NATO. They are virulently anti-Russia. They are virulently pro-conflict with Russia, and they take our tax money to propagandize us with papers talking about Russian aggression over and over again. You have the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Sounds great, except that it's headed up by Bill Kristol. And it's funded by the German Marshall Fund, which sounds like something the Germans fund, but they don't. We fund it. Our government funds it. So our government is giving money to Bill Kristol to secure democracy. And what does he do? They come up with this cockamamie scheme called Hamilton 68. And they use they won't tell us what, but some amazing technology to tell us what the Russian bots want us to think about. Think about the millions of dollars that are going to these crackpot schemes. What do they come up with? They can analyze hashtags on Twitter and tell us what the Russian bots want. Well, on Christmas Day, they told us that the Russian bots want us to be thinking about Christmas because the #1 trending item on Twitter, believe it or not, was Christmas. Likewise, they reported a 4,000% increase in Russian bot activity after the Duma attack in Syria because the hashtag Syria was trending. Okay, could it not have been that we were actually talking about Syria? But it's funny, but it's not in a way, because calling someone a Russian troll or a Russian bot has consequences. For the Ron Paul Institute, it's had consequences. Back the day after Thanksgiving in 2016, an organization called Prop or Not had a front page piece in the Washington Post attacking organizations that were doing the bidding of the Russian government. 200 unpatriotic organizations that were doing Putin's bidding. Who was among them? Unbelievable. LouRockwell.com, Antiwar.com, Consortium News, The Drudge Report, the Ron Paul Institute. The conspiracy is deeper than you can imagine. It's comical in a way, but it casts kind of a shadow over your organization. If you dare criticize what your government is telling you about what's happening overseas, you're not a person who's critical of our foreign policy. You're not, as Professor Eberling would say, against interventionism for very sound philosophical reasons. No, you're in the pay of a foreign government. You're doing the bidding of a foreign power, i.e. you're a traitor. So you're not just a guy that I disagree with, and maybe I really dislike you because I really don't like your views. No, you're something different. Traitors get shot. So it actually is very, very serious. It's very vicious. But why are they vicious like this? This is where I have a good news ending. The war party is losing control of the narrative, and I think that is fantastic news. The mainstream media is in decline, as we know, and independent media is on the rise. The Future of Freedom Foundation, Jacob Hornberger puts out fantastic pieces attacking the narrative. Other groups, Ron Paul Institute, Antiwar.com, so many. People on Twitter, people in Syria on Twitter, attacking the narrative. For example, look what happened in Syria after the Duma attack, so-called attack. Robert Fisk, he's pretty much a mainstream guy, but he's on the left, and he went there and he said, I interviewed a bunch of people, nobody even knows what you're talking about. This young fellow, Pearson Sharp from One American News Network, he's a right-wing guy, young fellow. He went there, he interviewed tons of people. He took all kinds of precautions. Because they say, oh, they're just minders, they're being set up. No, he was on the street, he would grab someone, and ask him. Nobody in the town had heard of it. Even the German television station went over there and interviewed people. They're losing control of the narrative. RT, oh no, don't say those words, right? RT went over there and interviewed this young fellow, Hassam Diab. The young little boy, remember, he was in the video. He was the main evidence that the white helmets shot, that this was an attack. It turns out he was called in there to the hospital. They started dousing him with water while they were videoing. And, a couple of days later, the kid said, I didn't know what was happening, And it's odd. They said, well, he's But it's obvious he wasn't a victim of a chemical attack because a couple of days later, he's a fine, young-looking 11-year-old boy. So it's coming apart. They cannot embed trusted journalists anymore like they could. They can't control the narrative like they could. That is where we fit in. There are too many independent sites that are too popular. People aren't taking the BS anymore. We haven't won, and I think it will get much worse before it gets better because it is getting vicious. The UK government had a horrible, the Times of London had a terrible front page article. These Assad apologists are working in academia. Basically, it was, I think, 3 or 4 professors in the UK who said they were skeptical about the official story on Duma. And they were presented in the front page of the Times as if they were, coming out denying the Holocaust or something. It was incredible. So there's a long way to go, but something very important is happening. They're losing control of the narrative, and we are gaining the upper hand. We are gaining control of the narrative. We have to be relentless. We're at the center of it. We're going to be challenged, but so is the war party going to be challenged. So I think we have to think about propaganda. We have to think about how we're being manipulated, refuse to be manipulated, and keep fighting back, keep supporting the Future of Freedom Foundation. If you like what the Ron Paul Institute does, please support the Ron Paul Institute. We have a little handout that we've given you. And again, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you all for coming out to visit with us today.
On the 4th of July, 1821, John Quincy Adams delivered one of the most remarkable speeches in U.S. history. The speech has gone down in history by the title, In Search of Monsters to Destroy. And in this speech, Adams tells Congress what the foreign policy of the United States is, the founding foreign policy of the country. He says that there's a lot of bad things that happen all over the world. They always have, they always will. He called them monsters. What he was talking about was things like totalitarian dictatorships, civil wars, famines, wars between countries, totalitarian dictatorships, oppression, censorship, killing people, torturing people. But he said, this is a country that will not go abroad to slay any of those monsters. That people will just have to work it out for themselves. Except that, interestingly enough, he said the United States would serve as a sanctuary for anybody that was able to escape these monstrous conditions. Adams made an interesting observation. He said that if the United States were ever to abandon this foreign policy of non-interventionism, America would become a dictatress. That is, a dictatorial type of regime that would end up exercising and wielding powers that were inherent to dictatorships. Now, at this time, even if the United States wanted to intervene in other countries around the world to slay these monsters, it lacked the means to do so. Because the size of the military was extremely small. Enough to put down some Indian uprisings, win a war against a third world neighboring country like Mexico. But other than that, a very small military force because of the antipathy that our American ancestors had toward what were called standing armies or great big permanent military establishments. It is impossible to overstate how different this country was when it was founded. Now, we know the horrific violation of liberty known as slavery. There were other less egregious violations of liberty like tariffs, like land grants to the railroads and all the governmental corruption that came with those. But if we set those aside and we look at things in an overall perspective, it is impossible to overstate how unusual this country was. It was one of a kind. There's never existed a country like this. Imagine, when the country's called into existence, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no welfare to speak of, no income tax. People were free to keep everything they earned, and there wasn't anything the government could do about it. No IRS, no drug war, no DEA, no SEC, virtually no economic regulation, certainly no minimum wage laws, no price controls, no Federal Reserve System, no fiat paper money. Gold and silver coins were the official money of the United States and the American people. No immigration controls. It is the most unusual society that has ever existed in the history of man. This is what it meant to be in America. This is what defined our nation. This is why when the French gave us the Statue of Liberty, this is what they had in mind. This unusual, weird, strange society. And no Pentagon, no CIA, no NSA, no FBI, no National Police Force. It brought into existence almost inadvertently a free market economy. Principles that Adam Smith had written about in his treatise, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations in 1776, the same year as the Declaration of Independence. And it brought into existence what we call a constitutionally limited government republic. That is a type of governmental system where the government's powers are extremely limited, very, very few. And the result of this? The result of an unhampered market economy and a non-interventionist foreign policy and no big permanent military intelligence establishment. The greatest outburst of creative energy that mankind has ever seen. Despite whatever they teach us in public schools about the Industrial Revolution, the standard of living of the American people from 1800 to 1900 skyrocketed. Tens of thousands of penniless immigrants were flooding American shores to get in on this. Because people were going from rags to riches in 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations. And they were doing it by savings because they were keeping everything they earned. I mean, imagine if you could keep everything you earned and you had no income taxes to pay at all, how much you could save. And that savings was going into productive capital, which was making people more productive, which was then causing wage rates, real wage rates, not inflationary wage rates, to rise decade after decade after decade. Americans had discovered the key to ending poverty. And that was through the massive accumulation of capital that was making people more productive. This goes on for a century with sound money. Gold and silver coins is the official money of the American people. And then all of a sudden, the late 1800s, things start to shift. Showing you the power of ideas, for better or for worse. That all of a sudden, socialist ideas began being imported from the socialists in Germany primarily. This is where Social Security originated. Among the socialists of Germany, national health care, public government schooling systems, and the idea of empire. The big turning point for foreign policy comes in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. The United States, there were people saying, look, okay, we've become a great nation. We've gone from continent, from one ocean to the other ocean. But the real greatness of a nation lies in acquiring colonies and acquisitions and controlling regimes around the world. They looked at the British Empire, they looked at the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, and they said, this is the key to a nation's greatness, even though these empires, especially the Spanish Empire, was crumbling precisely because it was an empire with its out-of-control spending and debt and inflation and debauchery of the currency to sustain these ever-increasing operations. So the U.S. intervenes in this war for independence on the part of the Cubans, the Filipinos, the Puerto Ricans, and they lead them into believing that they're going to help them secure their independence. And it was a lie. Because as soon as they got their independence, the U.S. said, guess what? We are now stepping in the shoes of the Spanish Empire. We now control you. And the Cubans were shocked. I mean, this is not what they had fought for. But yet U.S. troops went into Cuba and stayed in Cuba. That's how we ended up with Guantanamo Bay. That's how we ended up controlling this obsessive control over Cuba that exists even to this day on the part of the U.S. government. In the Philippines, the Filipinos resisted violently. They said, no, we fought for our independence against Spain, and we will fight for our independence against you. And the U.S. ended up killing hundreds of thousands of Filipinos and establishing control over the Philippines. That's how we get Guam, Puerto Rico. Because this, the imperialists were saying, is the key to America's greatness. And then comes the philosophy of interventionism that's percolating in the early part of the 1900s. It culminates in interventionism into World War I. Okay, so here you have this monster, war in Europe. Europe had been besieged by wars throughout the centuries. But President Wilson says, we are going to end all wars. This intervention is going to bring an end to war generally. This is the war to end all wars. That was the motto. Or to make the world safe for democracy, even though democracy is not even in the Constitution, even though the framers and our ancestors got the Bill of Rights enacted to protect us from democracy. But this is what this war was going to be about. A total shift in what had gone on before in our foreign policy of non-interventionism. So the U.S. intervenes, total defeat of Germany because of U.S. interventionism, and all it does is it lays the groundwork for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Through the Treaty of Versailles, through the economic conditions that existed in Germany as a result of this massive defeat. So World War II comes along, and we've all been taught, well, we defeated Hitler, right? We defeated Hitler. Great victory, right? Well, not according to the polls. And remember that the reason Great Britain had declared war on Germany in the first place was to free the Poles from Nazi tyranny. But at the end of the war, and all through the next 45 years, the Poles didn't consider it a victory. Why? Because they ended up for the next 45 years under communist control, under the control of our partner and ally, Stalin and the communists. And who arguably were as bad, if not worse, than the Nazis. China ends up under communist control. But here's the kicker. Americans are told as soon as the war is over that there is now a new official enemy. And that new official enemy is America's World War II partner and ally, the entity to whom they had turned over Eastern Europe at Yalta and Tehran, the conferences during World War II, the Soviet Union. That now we're told, even before we even catch our breath and celebrate this great victory in World War II, we're told, you can't stop. And most fundamentally occurs the most revolutionary transformation in a government, perhaps in history. Because what happens is that the U.S. government is transformed, converted from a constitutionally limited government republic to what we know today as a national security state. Now, what is a national security state? Well, North Korea is a national security state. China is a national security state. Russia is a national security state. Burma is a national security state. Egypt is a national security state. The United States, post-World War II, became a national security state. In a national security state, everything revolves around the concept of national security. National security is everything. It defines your existence. It defines the role of the government. It defines the powers of the government. It's everything. National security is everything. And in a national security state, the government wields massive powers. You've got a massive military establishment, permanent military establishment.
totally unlike anything the country had ever seen. I mean, Eisenhower points this out. And right before he leaves office, Eisenhower gives his farewell address, right when Kennedy's coming in. And he talks about the military-industrial complex, and he points out this is a new way of life for America. And it was a new way of life. Americans didn't recognize it. A lot of Americans didn't recognize it as a new way of life. They thought it was just a continuum from the time the nation got established all the way through today. Eisenhower recognized, no, it's a different way of life. And as Eisenhower pointed out, he pointed out exactly what the framers had pointed out, what our founding fathers had pointed out. Standing military establishments are a bane to liberty. That the military-industrial complex, as he called it, is a threat to our democratic processes. It's a threat to our freedoms. If you don't believe that, talk to people in Egypt. Talk to people in North Korea. And they will tell you what a national security state can do to the freedom and prosperity and peace of a nation. Now, keep in mind that you can be a national security state without having a foreign policy of empire and interventionism. I mean, North Korea is a classic example. Massive military establishment, surveillance over the citizenry, closely monitoring the citizenry, omnipotent powers, powers of assassination. We see the North Korean leader assassinating brothers or cousins or nephew, uncles or whatever, anywhere in the world, because a national security state has the power of assassination. But it doesn't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. But here we have a national security state that has combined with the concept of interventionism and empire. We see this almost right away with the Korean War, which was always just a civil war. It still is just a civil war. It's no more business of the United States than our civil war here is the business of Korea. But they told us, if they don't intervene without the constitutionally required congressional declaration of war, the Reds will come and get us. They'll take over the IRS and the government, and we'll live under communism forever. And so they intervene, and 40, 50,000 American men, dead. And the antipathy, a lot of people don't realize why the North Korean people hate the U.S. government so bad. The massive carpet bombing that took place during that war to kill everybody because they were all Reds. They were all communists. And then you've got, in 53, you've got a regime change operation, because this is another core aspect of interventionism. Not just empire by acquiring Cuba or the Philippines or Puerto Rico, but by putting your people in office locally and controlling them. And so our government destroys Iran's democratic system by ousting the democratically elected prime minister, who had been Time Magazine's Man of the Year, Mohammad Mossadegh. They oust him in a coup. They install this brutal dictator, the Shah of Iran. And they train his secret police force. That becomes a national security state. They model it after the United States, a national security state. They have a secret police force called the SAVAK. It's a combination CIA, FBI. They train them in the art of torture. And so the Iranian people are living under this brutal U.S.-trained dictator for 25 years until they finally revolt in 79 and unfortunately are not successful in reinstituting their democratic system. So they end up with a dictatorship that's arguably as bad as the U.S.-installed dictatorship of the Shah of Iran. But that's the root of the antipathy that the Iranian people have toward the United States, or specifically to the U.S. government. The Iranian people really love Americans. They just don't like the American government. And then in 54, the very next year, there's an intervention in Guatemala, ousting from power and planning his assassination of the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz. And they install, not surprisingly, because a national security state in Guatemala headed by a military general, because there's always this propensity to favor military generals. They establish order and stability like exists in Egypt. It's no surprise that the U.S. is supporting Egypt. It's a national security state modeled after the one here, where generals are running the show and the intelligence apparatus is running the show. They love that. So they destroy Guatemala's system. They throw it into a civil war, not surprisingly, because people's democratic choice has been ousted. So the civil war, like in Syria, It lasted, a lot of people don't realize this, lasted a decade, killed about 1 million people. Okay, then you've got the interventionism against Cuba. They told us, oh, Cuba's a dagger at the neck of America. We can't survive with a communist regime there. Cuba never attacked the United States or ever initiated any violence against the United States. It was always the other way around. An invasion, the Bay of Pigs, assassination attempts, partnerships with the mafia, and all with the intent to reinstall a U.S. dictator in Cuba, like the one that had preceded Castro, Fulgencio Batista, who, by the way, partnered with the mafia to run those casinos, knowing that the mafia was selling heroin and using Cuba as a way station for heroin into the United States. Oh, and by the way, Batista's forces were capturing young girls, kidnapping young girls, minor girls in the countryside, bringing them into Havana so that they could serve as sexual perks for the big wheelers in the casinos, as a perk for coming in and being in gambling in the mafia's casinos. This is what the Cuban people rebelled against, and this is what the U.S. was trying to install the entire time, reinstall. And then you've got in 73 the regime change operation in Chile, where again, democratically elected president Salvador Allende. They go in there, they kidnap and assassinate the commanding general of the Chilean armed forces, a man named Rene Schneider, totally innocent man. His crime, the reason why they kidnapped and killed him, the CIA, it was a CIA plot, was because he was saying, I will not go for a coup because it's unconstitutional. In our country, we decide things by election. Allende is won, the military will stand down. That's why they kidnapped and killed him and removed him from the scene, paving the way for a U.S. coup that installs this brutal dictator, Augusto Pinochet, who proceeds to round up about 60,000 people, innocent people, people whose crime was believing in socialism or communism, proceeds to rape, kill, execute thousands of them, and they live under this system for the next 20-some-odd years. Okay, so this is all the Cold War. You see the whole idea of, oh, the Reds are coming to get us. Oh, my gosh, the communists are coming. Martin Luther King's a communist, and the FBI's got to start, studying his habits and blackmailing him and hoping that he commits suicide. And the civil rights movement's a communist movement, and there's communists in Hollywood, and there's communists in the army, and there's this obsession that the national security state brought on for the American people. All justifying these interventions, and then there's Vietnam, where 58,000 of my generation is sacrificed for nothing. They said, oh, the dominoes are going to fall and the Reds are coming to America. Well, South Vietnam fell, and I didn't see any dominoes falling. And then suddenly in 1989, everything comes. Oh, by the way, not surprisingly, budgets are increasing for this massive military establishment, the CIA, the NSA, budgets every year skyrocketing, putting Americans more and more into debt, and always with the notion that it's just, we have to fight this Cold War, we just don't have a choice. Then suddenly in 1989, it's over. I mean, there was no treaty ending the Cold War. There were no negotiations. The Soviets just said, we're done. No more. And so they withdraw from East Germany. The Berlin Wall falls. They withdraw from Eastern Europe. They dismantle the Soviet Union. It's done. Now, the natural question arises. If, given that the federal government was converted from a republic to a national security state to fight the Cold War, and they said it was necessary to do this, in other words, it's necessary to adopt a dictatorial type of governmental system, that is a system that is inherent to dictatorships, to fight dictatorship. Once the Cold War is over, the natural question arises, why don't we get our republic back? What do we need this national security establishment for? But the national security establishment was so deeply ingrained now in our governmental structure that they weren't about to let go, despite the fact that their justification had evaporated. And so then we get this period of more interventionism, the Persian Gulf intervention, to effect a regime change operation against a former partner and ally, because this was part of the system, not only regime change, but supporting dictatorships that were favorable to the U.S. government. Partnerships with brutal dictatorial regimes. But they turn on them sometimes, like Assad, Syria, we're all taught about how bad Assad is. We forget that the CIA kidnaps a guy, a Canadian citizen, at Dulles Airport, Mahar Arar, and is convinced he's a terrorist, even though he's saying he's innocent. They rendition him to Syria. Now, this is post 9/11. We don't know how that deal got struck. They still won't tell us how it got struck. But how do you strike a deal with a dictator that you're saying is a new Hitler? But you see, they turned on Assad later on after they had partnered with him for a torture of Arar, who turned out, as it turns out, was totally innocent. He was tortured for 1 year and then released. So they turn on Saddam Hussein. They intervene. They expect him to be thrown out of office by people, but he stays in there. And so there's these complaints. Why didn't Bush go all the way to Baghdad? Why didn't they get rid of Saddam and put another pro-U.S. dictator in? Well, so that's what the sanctions were all about. For 10 years, interventionism consisting of sanctions, much like the embargo against Cuba that exists to this day, despite the fact that both Castros are out of office and despite the fact that Cold War ended 25 years ago. So you got these sanctions that are killing children. Tens of thousands of children throughout the 90s. 3 high UN officials resigned in protest of what they called genocide. And then there's that infamous statement by Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. I mean, she's the official spokesman for the United States. She announces publicly, tells 60 Minutes, that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children are worth it. Those are her words, worth it. And by it, she meant worth regime change, trying to get rid of Saddam. Imagine killing innocent children as a way to effect a political end. And the temperature in the Middle East was boiling, not just among like these 3 high UN officials that said, we want no part of this anymore. We have to resign out of conscience because there was nothing they could do to stop it. The U.S. was too powerful. And so, but the temperature's boiling in the Middle East over what's happening. You have the inevitable blowback. You have the terrorist attack in '93 on the World Trade Center. You have the terrorist attack on the USS Cole. In Yemen, by the way, the attack didn't take place over here in the Gulf of Mexico. It took place way over there where an imperial warship of the United States was visiting. Attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. And every time the terrorists would say, it's because of what you're doing with interventionism. Stop killing these children. Stop stationing your infidel troops near Mecca and Medina, the holiest lands of the Muslim religion. Stop supporting the Israeli state with foreign aid, money, and weaponry, and so forth. And then, of course, the ultimate blowback comes with 9/11. And immediately, what did they say? Oh, it has nothing to do with interventionism. It's just these people just hate us for our freedom and values. And so what do? They double down. They say, okay, the sanctions have not achieved what we wanted to achieve. The deaths of all the Iraqi children has not achieved regime change. So now we got our excuse. Americans are scared to death. So we conjure up this WMD deal, and we got to invade Iraq because the mushroom clouds are coming. It was just like a repeat of the Cold War stuff about the Reds coming to get us, only this was Saddam Hussein coming to get us with his WMDs. And so they go in there and they affect the regime change. And notice what they accomplish with their regime change operation. Massive death and destruction. The rise of ISIS. I mean, they produced ISIS with their intervention. The massive refugee crisis in Europe. Massive destruction of infrastructure, homes and businesses. And they called it Operation Iraqi Freedom. I mean, like, how free were these people who were being killed and tortured? And remember, they never apologized. The fact was that the Iraqis were never coming to get us. And yet they stayed there. They said it was about WMDs. Well, if it was about WMDs and they weren't lying about that, why'd they stay? Because ordinarily you would think, hey, admit your mistake, apologize, and get the heck out of there. But they stayed, continuing to kill people. And the same thing with with Afghanistan. Most of the people they've killed in Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11. I'd say 99%. And then you've got the Libya regime change operation. You got the Syria regime change operation. So you got this massive death and destruction. And oh, by the way, you have the loss of liberty and prosperity here at home. And this is what Adams was talking about. This is what Adams was saying was going to happen, that the government would become a dictatress. Because now we live under a system. Imagine this. Did you ever think this as a kid when you were growing up, that you would live under a government that has the power to assassinate its own people? I mean, we know North Korea's got that power, but so does the U.S. government, the U.S. national security state. That's what the Anwar al-Awlaki case was all about. And the court said, we're not touching this. If it deals with national security, which nobody's ever been able to define, we're not going to touch it. The CIA, the Pentagon, the NSA are supreme. They decide what national security is all about and what constitutes a threat. And if they need to assassinate Americans, they have that power, even though nobody ever gave them the power through a constitutional amendment. And then you've got the CIA power to take people into custody, the Pentagon, Americans into custody, and hold them forever without a trial. All they got to do is say you're a terrorist. That's what the Jose Padilla case was all about. And the courts confirmed it. And you got the power to torture Americans. This is what Adams was talking about. When he said America will become a dictatress, these are the powers they wield. Now, one might say, well, Jacob, they're not exercising the power. You don't see massive roundups like maybe in World War II with Japanese Americans or World War I where people that were opposing the war. That it's only happened to one or two times. But that's not the test of a free society. This is what the framers and our American ancestors understood. The test of a free society is whether the government wields the power. Because, in the right circumstances, all I got to do is unsheath the sword. But what we understood from the way that the country was established is you don't give government officials these powers. You prohibit these powers. That's what the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment's about. You don't kill anyone without a trial by jury, without due process of law. They have succeeded in circumventing those restrictions. That's the loss of liberty. People say, oh, we're losing our liberties. That ship sailed. We lost our liberty. The moment the government acquired the dictatorial power to assassinate, round up, and torture its own people, even if it's not exercising those powers on a widespread basis. Because given the right circumstances, they will do it. Now, if there was no alternative, if there was no solution to all this, we wouldn't be putting this material out on the chairs. We would be passing out cyanide capsules. Okay? The good news is there's a way out of this. And like when you're feeling bad, when you're feeling sick, and you don't know what's wrong, and the doctor can't diagnose, what do? You go back to founding principles. You say, oh, well, maybe I need to work on my diet. I need to work on exercise. You start doing some soul searching, reflecting to get yourself feeling better again. That's what we need to do as a country. And the way we do it is we go back to founding principles. And we look for the answer there. A constitutionally limited government republic, a foreign policy of non-interventionism, a free market system that gave us the most prosperous and, oh, by the way, the most charitable nation in history. And so there is a way out. Now notice we're talking about two separate things here. We're talking about foreign interventionism and we're talking about a national security state. They're related, but they're not the same thing. If we tackle one problem, we solve most of the problems, and that's the foreign interventionism part. We bring all the troops home from everywhere. Korea, Europe, World War II's over, Japan, Africa, South America, bring all of them home, like Switzerland. Switzerland doesn't have troops in overseas countries, and oh, by the way, have you noticed there's no terrorist attacks against Swiss? In fact, there's not even any random mass killings like they are here in the United States, which I think is rooted again in this mindless, massive killing machine that the U.S. government has unleashed in other parts of the world. So you bring all the troops home and suddenly you have no more terrorist blowback. And you save all the money that's associated with those expenses of empire and interventionism that have brought down countries, that have bankrupted countries. You save all that money. You discharge all the soldiers into the private sector. You don't need them anymore. They're overseas doing things that are not constructive. Discharge them. There's a doubly positive effect. Now, not only are they not living off tax revenues, they're in the private sector producing wealth. And the people who are paying the taxes now get to keep their money. So all that money goes into private productive capital. So that's that. And the good news is that the Pew Foundation has done a series of polls in the last few years and has found that 70% of the American people now believe it's time for the U.S. government to mind its own business in world affairs. Let the world work out its problems. That's 70%. I mean, when I told you earlier that we believe in the power of ideas and adherence to principle, we are getting very close to what might be a critical mass that sweeps across society and demands an end to foreign interventionism. Now, the other part of the problem is more difficult for people to comprehend, and I'm not suggesting you automatically agree with what I'm saying about the national security establishment and a constitutional republic. What I'm here to do is to share ideas with you so that you can process and digest them, and you make your own decision. But I say that if you want a free society, if you want a peaceful society, a prosperous society, you got to go in this second area too. You got to dismantle this thing. We have a unique opportunity in this country. There is no nation state anywhere that has the ability to invade the United States. They just don't have the money. They don't have the interest across the oceans, the transport ships, the troops. I mean, it's an insurmountable problem to invade the United States. We have the opportunity to seize that opportunity, to capitalize on it, dismantle this entire totalitarian-like apparatus, and restore the founding principles that the United States was founded on. The principles of a limited government republic with no NSA, no CIA, no massive permanent military establishment, a constitutionally limited government republic. Can we do this? Look. People in 1776 and 1789 and 1791, they're no different from any of us in this room. You are the new founding fathers. It's necessary to look beyond your everyday circumstances. We all got our problems in life. We know that. You know, life's not easy, okay? And it's tough sometimes facing the everyday problems of life, children or financial or whatever. But what we have to do is rise above that. The same way they did in 1776 and 1789, we have to rise above it and think at a higher level. Say, what can I do to leave this country a better place? How can I restore freedom and prosperity and harmony and peace for myself, especially myself, but also for those coming after us? And if we do that, if we stand on principle, this idea of non-interventionism and this idea of a constitutional republic can sweep across a country. There's a reason why totalitarian dictatorships won't allow meetings like this, because they know how dangerous they are. Because ideas can grip a person's mind, they can grip a person's heart, especially the love of liberty, and all of a sudden they spread across a land by wildfire. But it means standing on principle, even in your own little bailiwick, within your family, within your friends. And then multiply that by people doing that all across the country, and all of a sudden, we change the world. And that's what we have the opportunity to do. I don't think the world can get out of this status morass in which it finds itself. I think it's only the Americans that can lead us out of this thing, lead the world out of this thing. And we have that opportunity. If we stick with our principles of liberty, and if we adhere to principles, and we go back to founding principles, I have no doubt that it is us, the American people, that is ultimately going to lead the world to the highest reaches of freedom that mankind has ever seen. Thank you very much. And the first question we received is, please explain the connection between the Federal Reserve System and America's foreign policy of foreign intervention. Richard, you want to go first? Is it on?
Hello? Hello? Oh, yes, it is working. Okay.
The connection that, at least one level of the connection that one can draw between the Federal Reserve and American foreign intervention is the capacity of the United States government to draw upon a source of wealth. If the United States had to run a balanced budget and therefore had to go to the American people and immediately and directly say, if we want to do policy X, this is the estimated cost. Therefore, to do this policy X, we must increase taxes by a certain dollar amount, and this is going to be the incidence of the taxes. That's just the economist lingo, is who pays it and how much. People would therefore know the cost of what government activities involve. This applies to foreign policy as well. If the United States government wants to fight a foreign war, you tell the American citizens what you estimate is going to be the charge, and therefore the increase in the taxes, and upon whom, in what amounts. But they don't have to do that. That's the miracle of deficit spending. The government borrows a sum of money that represents the excess of its spending over what it takes in taxes, and that burden does not appear directly to the American taxpayer. It is as if wealth has been created for the government to spend out of thin air. Think of it this way. Suppose that someone says to you, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you $100 worth of goodies, but I'm only going to charge you $60 or $70 for it. Isn't that a bargain? Who's going to turn down $100 of desirable stuff and only be charged $60 or $70? Right? That's like when somebody says, on sale, 25% off. But the fact is, the government has to do one of two things. If it's going to spend 100 but only tax people 70, it has to go into the financial market and borrow the other $30. Now that can be financed in one of two ways. It means the government is now going to be taking part, siphoning off part of the savings of the society, and spend that savings on those programs, as opposed to that $30 being available to fund and support private sector investment activities. That's, in a sense, clear. Interest rates will rise because government has increased the demand to borrow in financial markets, or the Federal Reserve can come in. And the Federal Reserve can do what is, again, in the jargon of the economist, monetize the debt. That's nothing more than saying that the Federal Reserve increases the money supply to cover the number of dollars the government wants to borrow. Now, in the short run, it seems that, well, we're not crowding out private investment. We're not increasing the tax burden on the American taxpayer. It's just somehow out of thin air, and then the government just spends this extra money. Now, when the government can do that on domestic programs, it's hard enough to see it. But when the government is also doing this in foreign policy, it again seems as if the government can undertake more military spending, more foreign adventurism, than the taxpayer understands is the real cost and the burden. I would suggest that if the government said, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Iraq, we're in Syria, we're having bases in countries X, Y, and Z, and here is the real price tag that has to be paid here and now on an annual basis to cover this plus everything else the government is spending on domestically, a lot more Americans would be suspicious and resistant of it. But the central bank enables the government to create an illusion of guns and butter, as the old Vietnam War phrase used to say, because the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air to cover all that government deficit spending.
Yeah.
I would just add very briefly to what Professor said, which I thought was great, would be to also keep in mind the psychological impact of no-cost wars. We understand the monetary impact of no-cost wars, but psychologically, what does it do to the American people? I think it makes them more inclined toward the use of aggressive force to solve problems. As Nicholas Taleb has written and is famous for, particularly in his most recent book, They Have No Skin in the Game. We seldom see in front of us the consequences of an aggressive foreign policy. You may know a soldier, someone knows the next soldier, but you don't see on the day-to-day basis what people in for example, Fallujah or Aleppo see. So the psychological impact, Dr. Paul puts it very well, you subsidize something, you get more of it. The Federal Reserve subsidizes war, and so we see much more war and much more acceptance of the concept that problems overseas are best solved by the use of force.
Yeah, I'll amplify what you guys have said about just by pointing to the genius of our American ancestors. I mean, they knew this was going to happen. There was widespread antipathy toward calling the federal government into existence with the Constitution. I mean, the people have been operating under the Articles of Confederation for some 13 years. Under the Articles, the federal government didn't even have the power to tax. And so when the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, everybody thought, oh, well, they're just going to modify the Articles. And they come out with this newfangled federal government idea. And people were very, very suspicious. No, you're going to end up with a government that involves us in wars, that's going to debauch our currency, that's going to kill us, that's going to torture us, like the Tower of London, all the stuff they lived under with the British Empire when they were British citizens. And so they finally went along with a deal as long as the Bill of Rights was passed to try to stop this kind of thing. But there was no income tax. So they knew that there was no way the federal government had the money to get involved in all these wars, and there was no Federal Reserve System. There was no central bank to do what Richard Dan have said, is that finance the borrowing that inevitably goes into paying for these wars. We're often taught that the gold standard was paper money backed by gold. That's not the case at all. It was gold and silver coins were the official money. You see this in the Constitution, that the states are prohibited from making anything but gold and silver coin legal tender. Now, the federal government borrowed money, but the federal government was not given the power to make paper money. Everybody understood that the official money was gold and silver coins, and that the bonds they issued and the bills they issued were promises to pay that real money. Well, that terribly constricted their power to wage these wars and engage in empire, because you can't print gold and silver coins. And so they had no ability, very little ability, through no income taxation, you can't raise a lot of money, and through the inability to just print the money to finance the deficit, as Richard pointed out. Okay, second question. Interesting. Okay, this is about America's relationship with Russia. That she says that the diatribes against Russia occur daily, and people are being indoctrinated in the anti-Russia attitudes, and everybody's expected to have this anti-Russia mindset. And she wants to know, how can the Ron Paul Institute and the Future Freedom Foundation, and really, how can Americans counter this fear-mongering about Russia with respect to America's foreign policy? You want to go first, Dan?
Yeah, sure. Well, it is probably worse than the McCarthyist era in the U.S. right now, where people are attacked. There are people who attack us regularly because we will appear on RT. It's kind of funny. I do go on RT fairly frequently when I have time. And I've also been on a few of the mainstream media shows. On RT, I've never been asked what I'm going to say. In fact, several times I've said, look, I know the Russian government's position on this, and I think it's wrong, and I'm going to say it if you have me on. They say that's fine. Whereas when, for example, I've been interviewed by Canadian radio, pre-interviewed by Sky, it was a half an hour long pre-interview. Then they called back the next day and said, we've decided not to do that segment. So I tell them that it's not who gives us the platform. It's just that we are allowed to have a platform to talk about non-interventionism, to talk about peace and prosperity with Russia. The Bolsheviks had a saying, tell us who likes you and we'll tell you who you are, what you are. And that's really what has come back. It's a Bolshevist mentality here that is extremely dangerous in our society. It is so, if you're on Twitter and you see the kinds of things that are being said, the kinds of things that are being blamed on Russia, it's just mind-boggling. You feel you're in some sort of a time warp, or even worse than a time warp.
Well, let's make some distinctions here. The Russian government under Vladimir Putin is an authoritarian regime that is corrupt, violent, manipulative, and power-lusting. So there's no need to be apologistic for them domestically. And the Putin government, like most governments around the world that have certain size and resources at their disposal, want to be a player on the world. So Putin and the Russian government have this desire to restore Russia as a national global player, have influence again, overcome what they view as the humiliation of having lost the Cold War and having to give up their empire. So they have played their games in Crimea, in the Ukraine. They've intervened to maintain their naval bases in Syria, which they had from the Soviet era. And they have these other alliances for pragmatic purposes with Iran and so on. And they view that the United States and Europe played tricks on them. And one of the tricks is that when the Soviet Union was giving up its Eastern Bloc empire, the understanding is that NATO would not expand into Eastern Europe. That it would sort of be, the Soviets would be gone and Russia would not influence it then. But at the same time, the NATO would not move east. Well, they did. And since politicians and nation states and bureaucrats tend to be paranoid, regardless of what nation you're talking about, the Russians view that this was cheated on them. Now, as a result of all of this, the Russians have responded in their own statist and interventionist, imperialistic ways, as I just said. This plays into the hands of those in America who, at different levels of consciousness, I suppose, in government, believe that it is necessary and useful to have a foreign enemy. I mean, how do you justify the defense budget? How do you justify the national security state? How do you justify the size of a global military presence if you do not have enemies to which the U.S. has to serve as, quote, a bulwark against? And so as a result of this, Russia has become a boogeyman. And particularly since Putin is such a despicable authoritarian individual, it makes it easier. When the guy you're propping up as your straw man himself is a monster, it makes it easier for him to be a straw man for your domestic purposes. Given this, it now serves the political purposes of a lot of people in the United States, the Democrats. The Democrats have not accepted that Hillary lost. This was a shock for them. Now, most people know that there are several stages of grieving. First denial, then anger, then you go through several others, and finally you reach acceptance. They're still in denial and anger. They can't get beyond this. So they have, well, how could we have not stayed in power? It must be the Russians. And it also plays upon their base and everything else, so they need the Russian boogeyman. On the other hand, other than Trump, for his own reasons, it serves the purpose of a lot of neocons and people in the military to say that Russia is a boogeyman, along with China and its own military buildup, to say that the Russians are aggressive, we have to be a bulwark against them in various parts of the world. And this is the problem we have. It serves the political agendas and purposes of both political parties, of bureaucracy, and it plays well in the media. How do you get people to watch CNN and Fox 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? By having boogeymen and crises, and so this just plays into it. And this is what that Russia plays in this whole area. If it wasn't Putin, in my opinion, it would be some other nation. More logically, if Putin was a pussycat, both domestically and in foreign affairs, it would be President Xi of China and the Chinese. I mean, they're the ones who are undertaking this aggressive action that Congressman Sanford pointed out in Southeast Asia and national Chinese greatness and so on. It would just be the Chinese who would be the bigger boogeyman. It just serves domestic purposes.
If I could just gently disagree with the professor on a number of points. You mentioned Ukraine in the context of Russian expansionism, whereas in fact it was a U.S. regime change policy in Ukraine that started the conflict. How do we know that? Well, the U.S. government told us itself. Victoria Nuland was caught on tape talking about how we're going to overthrow the government, talking about who we're going to put in position. And so when you have a situation like that, it leads to reactions. One of the reactions was Crimea, which is 90% Russian. When all of a sudden you have a U.S.-inspired coup in Ukraine that turns the country virulently anti-Russian, particularly in the Donbass to the east, where Russian is spoken by about 98% of the population, you have Crimea, which is 90% Russian, having a reaction. If the U.S. is going to foment a coup in Ukraine that is anti-Russian, we're going to jump for the lifeboats. And so what they did is they held a referendum where the people voted to rejoin Russia, which they had been part of for centuries. So I think you're missing the boat a little bit on that, with all due respect. The other thing is, this is just a matter of personal preference, but I don't, as I mentioned in my speech, like to use the adoption of neocon interventionist language, talking about foreign leaders as despicable monsters, because it leads toward an aggressive perspective, and it leads toward the acceptance of intervention toward the country. So I don't mean to any offense, but
if I may, I refuse to follow a line that would say Hitler and Stalin were pussycats. I don't want to call them monsters, because it might create a bad impression in America. Okay. The other thing is, yes, the United States played its own game in Ukraine. That's true. That doesn't justify the Russians to take over Crimea. That would be like saying, well, you know, the Russians come into some country in Central America, so that would justify the United States to military intervene in that country. No, it would. I think most libertarians would be horrified if the United States then did that merely because the Russians were to play some similar game in a Central American country. It's symmetrical. If the United States plays its own manipulative game in Ukraine, that's not a justification for the Russians to do this. And the election in Crimea was not a free and fair election.
How do you know that?
It was not a free and fair election. The Russians the Russians are manipulators and power lusters. The government of Russia is.
You just said the Russians are manipulative, just like what's his name?
Okay.
The head of the CIA.
Okay. Okay. When you say the Russians in this context, it's like talking about the Americans or the French or the Germans. What you mean is the government and those who run the government. It's like referring to America or Washington. You're referring to the political establishment. I'm not making a racist statement, and it is a misrepresentation of all common sense language in talking about these matters to express it that way. Putin's government kills dissidents. Putin's government attempts to manipulate other countries. Putin's government seized the seized Crimea and manipulated election. Did the Ukrainians in Crimea have a choice? Did the Tatars in Crimea have a choice? No. They did not vote for it. 4
years later, they're very happy in Crimea.
All right,
okay.
All right, let me add.
Yes.
Please be respectful to the speakers.
Let me
yes, and they were happy Jews in Theresienstadt.
Let me just put things in an overall generalized context. Any national security state, y'all have heard me describe what a national security state is. The coin of the realm of any national security state is fear. You have to keep people afraid. I mean, from the very beginning, President Truman, when he was thinking in terms of converting the federal government to a national security state, he was told, you've got to scare the hell out of the American people to get this through, because the Americans are not going to easily give up their republic. And they did. The fear was of the Soviet Union, the communist threat. They're coming to get us. The dominoes are going to fall. And by the way, national security states over there do the same thing. In North Korea, one of the main things they use to maintain their grip on power is the threat of a U.S. attack.
which in their minds is a very real possibility, especially after Iraq and all the things that happened with Cuba during the Cold War, calling North Korea part of the axis of evil, that fear, then people say, oh, take away our liberties, centralized power. The same thing in Cuba, that the threat of a U.S. invasion again, we have to centralize power. So that's what goes on here as well, is that they always need official enemies. Fear is the coin of the realm. So when they lost the Soviet Union, I'm not convinced they really wanted to lose the Soviet Union. I think this anti-Russia mentality and mindset is really a continuation of that Cold War mindset. The only difference is that they can't say, oh, the commies are coming to get us, the Reds are coming to get us. It's the Russians. Or if it's not Russians, it's the terrorists. If it's not the terrorists, it's ISIS. If it's not ISIS, it's Saddam Hussein, who they call the new Hitler. Or it's the illegal aliens, or it's the drug dealers. Whatever it is, that's what they have to do. They have to keep people afraid in order to maintain their existence and their justification for existing. Okay, next question. Okay, recent polling suggests a majority of Americans across the political spectrum are growing increasingly weary of open-ended military interventions abroad. How do we work to effectively separate the concepts of patriotism from militarism and the idea that being opposed to the next war is somehow analogous to being soft on terrorism, unpatriotic, or, quote, isolationist? Dan?
What we try to do on the Liberty Report, and it's very difficult, it's a real challenge because there is the concept that militarism equals patriotism. And if you think about it, it's pretty illogical because if you really are a patriot, if you really want America to be strong and be successful, why would you endorse a policy that's guaranteed to weaken the country? Why would you endorse a policy that sends the yearly military budget is over $1 trillion when you add up all the components of the national security state, as Bumper so rightly terms it? Why would you endorse something that will make us weaker, that will, as Dr. Paul says, eventually lead to a complete economic breakdown when we are on our backs, when we are at the mercy of our adversaries overseas? We're not a strong nation, and that is coming. We cannot continue to maintain a military budget that's equal to the next 7, 8, or 9 countries combined. It's literally impossible to do. And if you study people like Chuck Spinney and the experts at military procurement reform, you'd understand that not only can we not sustain that spending, the money, because of the way weapon systems are front-loaded, and it's too long to get into now, but we're actually getting worse quality weapon systems because of the way that weapons are being procured. That's why we have the F-35 that cannot fly, with a $200,000 helmet that can't fly. 50% currently, right now, 50% of the F-35s are not capable of flying, the most expensive aircraft in the history of the world. So we're not getting a better product. We're getting a worse product, and it's costing us more. That will weaken us. That is the first thing, is to emphasize that patriotism costs the destruction of America through overspending. The other, I would just say, to reaffirm once again, to reject the demands of the neocons and interventionists, that you subscribe to the idea of demonizing the Hitler of the week, because that sets the stage for interventions. That sets the stage for us to continue our murderous and self-destructive foreign policy.
One of the most sort of rhetorical and content difficulties is how to reestablish or improve the use and the meaning of the word patriotism because of its misuse and abuse and manipulation by most governments around the world for their own respective purposes, including the United States. What is a patriot? Now, to me, and I can only speak for myself, as a classical liberal, as a libertarian, I would consider a patriot of freedom is one who grounds his belief that the good society is a society of individual liberty, free markets, and voluntary association, and that one feels a loyalty to that country and to defend it, where those rights and free and voluntary relationships are respected, and the government limits itself to securing those liberties and freedoms, as I referred to in my own talk earlier. The problem is that patriotism is, as often said, is the last refuge of a scoundrel. You wrap yourself in the flag, you say that this is in the national interest, this serves the needs of the country, and you then challenge anyone who dissents from this. Oh, you don't love America, you're unpatriotic, you want to sell out to some boogeyman abroad, and so on. And it's a very delicate balance. I believe that historically there are legitimate meanings and understandings of patriotism, the patriot of a free society and the principles of freedom. But unfortunately, like the word liberal, it has been so twisted and bastardized for political and ideological purposes of those not just on the left, but often on the left, that it's a difficult task to redefine it and contextualize it in a way that's either not going to be understood or will again be open to manipulation and abuse.
Yeah, I agree with both of what they said. I'd like to add that I think a core problem here is that all too many people conflate the government and the country. In their minds, the federal government is America. So that if you criticize the federal government, you hate America, you're attacking your country. When actually these are two separate entities. The country and the government are two separate entities. We see this phenomenon reflected by the Bill of Rights, which, by the way, does not give us rights at all. If you look at it really carefully, you'll see it doesn't give us rights. Instead, it protects the country from the federal government, protects our rights from the federal government. Now, to me, the patriot is the person that stands for what is right, even or especially when the government is in the wrong. That's what takes the courage. It doesn't take any courage, as far as I'm concerned, to support whatever the government does. The courage comes from people in the private sector that says, what you're doing is wrong, especially when the government can retaliate by doing bad things, killing the dissident, IRS audited the dissident, whatever. That's the true patriot. I mean, when you look at people that signed the Declaration of Independence, we look at them as patriots, but they were British citizens. We often forget that. They were not American citizens. They were British citizens. They took on their own government and said, what you're doing here is wrong. The best example of this dichotomy, in my opinion, is a group, involves a group called the White Rose. And I wrote an essay on this that I invite you to read. I think it's my favorite essay I've ever written in the 29 years I've been doing this. It's called The White Rose, A Lesson in Dissent. And it was republished in a magazine, in a book for high school students about the Holocaust. That the Germans had the same position on patriotism as many Americans. That when the war starts, you support your government. The time for debate is over. You got to rally to the troops. You got to support the troops. And that's pretty much the concept that a lot of Americans hold. That, we're at war now. You got to support the government. Certainly that took place after the Iraq War started. Well, in Nazi Germany, there was a group of college students called the White Rose. They were led by a brother and sister called Hans and Sophie Scholl, who started publishing essays contrary to the Nazi regime. They were secret, they were surreptitious. This was about in 1943, and they were distributing them secretly. Now, they were caught. They were given a trial within 3 days, a quote trial. If you want to see a fantastic movie, go rent Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, which really depicts what happened at the trial, because they found all the documents later on. And how this girl, this young woman, Sophie Scholl, stands up to these Nazi tyrants on the court. And they considered her a traitor. They executed her and her brother. They were like 21, 22 years old. Along with their friends, they executed them because they were traitors. Well, we look back on this, and the German people, by the way, look back on it and say, they were the patriots. They were the ones taking the stand for what was right. And I think that's what patriotism is really all about. Standing for what's right, standing for what's moral, especially when your government's moving in the opposite direction. Okay. Okay. This guy's soon to be a commissioned officer in our nation's military. What type of outlook mentality should I have going into the military? Richie, you want to go first or last?
It is a difficult time, if one holds classical liberal or libertarian views, for a person to serve in the military. As I said, a free society and its preservation requires a constitutionally limited government. And such a constitutionally limited government must involve the government's ability to undertake a legitimate and rightful national defense against any existing or imminent aggressive threat from another nation. So certainly in the philosophy of freedom, there is a right of self-defense, and the collective version of that is the limited constitutional government. So to serve in such a military for such preservations of freedom is both legitimate and in those circumstances, I would even say honorable. Just as the policemen or the firemen who properly and legitimately within the law do their duties. But it creates a conflict of conscience sometimes in our current situation, that you sign into the military and you agree to follow orders, though even the military has its own code of military justice that even specifies when it is legitimate not to obey certain orders in certain circumstances. But even if there's not such a violation in the Code of Military Justice, you may very well be required to go into harm's way and to follow orders that exceed the legitimate defense actions of the United States government as understood by a friend of freedom. And that's a decision of conscience that only that person can make. And I don't know how else to answer that.
That's a very difficult question to answer, and I struggle like Professor Ebeling does as well. I had a very good friend, John Sharp, who was a commander in the U.S. Navy. He graduated at the top of his class at the U.S. Naval Academy. And when the Iraq War started, or was started in 2003, he's also a publisher. And he published a series of essays under the title Neocon 1 and 2. Very important books, and essentially one of them featured great anti-war writers on the left and right, Pat Buchanan, Sam Francis, and many others, Alex Coburn and so many others. And the other book was a philosophical book, and it dealt with Aquinas and St. Augustine and about the concept of just war. The implication of the two books, of course, was that the Iraq War did not meet the justification, did not meet the requirements to be considered a just war. And the U.S. Navy threw everything it could at him. He was brought up on charges. His naval career was destroyed. He was accused of all sorts of horrific, grotesque things that he did not do. Essentially, a very bright young military officer's career was destroyed because of it. So it is a very delicate thing. I will say that Commander Sharp's story had a silver lining, because after years and years in the wilderness of having his career destroyed and of living with, I think, his 8 children on a shoestring, he spent his entire time studying military law and studying law in general. He fought his own case. He fought back against them, and in fact actually was victorious just this past year. Not only did he have all of his back pay, but all of the promotions that he was due that he had not gotten. So there's a silver lining, but what an awful sacrifice to make to stand by your principles, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone.
Yeah, I agree with both of them. I think going into the military today is the most difficult thing for any individual because of this problem of conscience. And I speak as a former infantry officer, former graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. If your military is limited to defense, like the Swiss military is, then there's not a problem. You're serving your country to defend your country in case that invasion ever comes, and nobody ever invades the Swiss because they know it'd be by like swallowing a porcupine, and nobody would invade the United States if the military was here just defending the country. But that's not what's happening. The military is being sent abroad to kill people, none of whom have ever attacked the United States. If you count up all the people that the U.S. forces, U.S. soldiers have killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and anywhere else, none of them have initiated violence against the United States. The United States has been the initiator of the violence. Even 9/11 was retaliatory violence for what had already gone on before. So the soldier is put into a very interesting position of kill or be killed. And that is problematic. I ran this by a Catholic priest friend of mine after the invasion of Iraq started. He's a libertarian. And he was a good friend of mine. And I said, if I were in that position, being sent to Iraq, what is my duty as a Catholic? And he says, you can't kill anybody over there. That and I said, but wait a minute, they're shooting at you. He says, you are the aggressor. You, under God's law, do not have the right to kill anybody when you're the aggressor. It's like a burglar of a home. You know, the burglar goes into the home and the homeowner shoots at him, and the burglar shoots back and says, I was only defending myself. Well, it's the same thing in these foreign escapades. The person's put in the position of kill or be killed, and if he's religiously inclined, he's in a very difficult position because he has to decide, should I kill or be killed when I know there's theological ramifications here? This is another reason why we need to dismantle this whole thing. This is never something you should put your soldiers into, this type of moral predicament. So it's an abuse of your armed forces to do this. Another good reason for dismantling this interventionist foreign policy.
If I can just add one more thought to this. Maybe some of you are familiar with Leonard E. Reed. He was the founder and longtime first president of the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE. During the Korean War, I think it was 1951, he wrote an essay called Conscience on the Battlefield. He lost a lot of support because of this essay. You know, it's a lot of financial support from donors. But he felt it was a matter of conscience himself to write this. It is a young American soldier dying in Korea. And as he's dying, he's asking himself the questions, why has my government sent me here? Why have I been put in the position of having to shoot and kill people who have not attacked me, my family, or my country? And why have I been in the position to now slowly seeing the life drain from me? Why has my government put me in the position of myself being one of the victims? And this raises the whole issue of what is a military for? What legitimate functions can the government perform in putting young men in harm's way and put them in the horrifying predicament of having maybe to kill others to preserve their own life because being put into a position that has nothing to do with freedom per se. These are difficult issues, but I think that sometimes to get at the truth and sort of sort out what's right and wrong and what needs to be done, difficult questions have to be asked and answered.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if you're an officer, your mission is to keep your men safe. Don't go off on any heroic missions to, you're spreading democracy or you're doing this or doing that. Your mission as an officer is, especially in these foreign escapades, these imperialist, interventionist escapades, you keep your men safe and you bring back everybody alive and don't take any risks that involve their lives or their safety. Okay, next question, and we got about 7 more minutes, so this is probably the last one. I believe our best chance for regaining our individual freedom comes from the inevitable economic reality that will result from the government's spending policies. Given the strength of the present welfare state and warfare state, do you think there is a realistic chance that we can vote ourselves free?
Richard? Okay. Nothing is inevitable. Nothing is deterministically set in stone. You can go through a very number of periods of history and say, look, we're on this tragic path. There's no way out. It's the end of freedom. It's the end of democracy. It's this, that, and the other. And invariably, it has not always been as disastrous as seemed while living through it. Now, sometimes it is disastrous, but it doesn't have to be. The fact is that it is not set in stone. that entitlement programs cannot be changed. It's only called entitlement to create the false impression that it cannot be modified. It's mandatory, as it says. Discretionary spending, mandatory spending. It's only mandatory for as long as the legislation is either repealed or radically modified. It requires a sea change in the thinking and attitudes of the American people. Often it requires a crisis for people to ask themselves, am I, and in this sense of policy, are we as a country on the right road? Or do we need to backtrack and get on a better road? What's important is that we are facing a fiscal crisis. And while defense spending and military overreach, as the U.S. government has been undertaking, is a crucial element of it, the fact is what is eating us alive fiscally with taxes and with the deficits and the growing debt is domestic entitlement spending. If you add up Social Security and Medicare and all of the programs under those two headings, plus the interest that we currently pay on the national debt, that eats up approximately 40% of the U.S. government's budget deficit. And that's anticipated to just grow because of the mandatory spending obligations under Social Security and Medicare under current legislation. That is what has to be changed. These are very appealing programs. Oh, the government is going to give me retirement money. The government is going to take care of my health care. And of course, this is pandered and played to from everybody from Hillary Clinton to Bernie Sanders to, unfortunately, too many Republicans. But the fact is that it's not set in stone. It is becoming a more fiscal crisis situation with each passing year, particularly as the annual deficits are going to become closer and then reaching $1 trillion a year again, as in the early years of the Obama administration. And it may be a wake-up call for people to ask themselves, what kind of future do I want for myself and my children and my grandchildren, and the threat that it therefore holds for the country as a whole and its economic and political future.
Okay, let me go second, and then I'll let Dan wrap the whole conference up. Yeah, I agree with that. Nothing's inevitable. I mean, if it were inevitable, we'd still have a society with none of this stuff that existed throughout the 1800s. But the interventionists, the socialists, through the power of their bad ideas, were able to shift the course of the country. Well, if they could shift it in a bad direction, we can shift it in a good direction. And that's the power of ideas on liberty. That's why we're here. The adherence to principles. We can lead the world out of this morass, but it takes that commitment of a people that want to be free. And I think one of the most important questions that every one of us should be asking across America: what is the role of government, the legitimate role of government in a free society? Should it be to take money from Peter to give it to Paul? Should it be to police the world? Should it be to try to control regimes around the world, support brutal dictatorships? And I would suggest that if enough Americans reach the right answers to that, we're going to see major, monumental change in a positive direction, in the direction of peace and freedom, prosperity and harmony. So let me take this opportunity, and then I'll pass it over to Dan. Thank you again for coming. Thank you for your great support, those of you that support us. We would love to have your support, those of you that are just learning about FFF. Your donations, they help fund these kind of programs in other parts of the country. And take a look at what we do at fff.org. And if you like it and you like our style, even if you don't agree with everything we do, we would love to have your support. So, Dan, it's been a great honor to do this with you guys. It's exciting. I hope we can do it again.
It's been an absolute thrill working with one of my heroes. I would just add to what you said, Bumper, and you kind of said what I wanted to say. But I would just echo Dr. Paul, what he always says: we don't need a majority. That's why we shouldn't get discouraged. We don't need a majority. We don't need 50% plus one person to endorse our views. There's actually strength. This is one area where Lenin and the Bolsheviks were right. There is strength in being a minority if it's an intellectually cohesive minority. Once the idea is ready, it will be impossible to stop. So that's why we're planting seeds as we go. And these are the seeds that we're planting, and thank all of you to continue with the metaphor, helping us nurture these seeds. And that's what you'll do when you leave. You'll talk to people, you'll talk to friends and family members, and that will continue it. So that's why we're so grateful to have you take time out of your day to join us, to be part of what we're trying to do. And again, as to echo what Jacob said, if you do support what the Ron Paul Institute does and what FFF does, we have a little donation coupon in there that tells you how to help us continue doing what we do. We have a conference coming up in August. I'll be sending an email to anyone who's registered when we get the date. It'll be our annual Washington, D.C. conference. We've already got some really nifty speakers lined up, but I can't say who yet. But subscribe to our YouTube channel, Ron Paul Liberty Report. Read our website, ronpaulinstitute.org. Follow what we do. Follow us on Twitter, etc. And thank you very much for joining us.